The Last Shifter's Baby by Lionel Law. A Romancely.com story. Blurb. A shifter, pregnancy, paranormal romance novel. Zoologist Rebecca knows how to work hard and isn't afraid of going headfirst into a challenge. Romance, on the other hand, is a whole different ballgame. Especially after her rough breakup with her now ex-boyfriend. Just when she's about to give up on love, she crosses paths with fellow zoologist, Luke, and totally hits it off. However, Luke has a mysterious secret that has something to do with all the strange animals that have been appearing. And now that their relationship is getting more serious, Rebecca must deal with the truth behind the man. Can their love survive, especially now that she's pregnant with his baby? Or will Luke's paranormal secret drive her away from the man she thought she loved? Get answers in this Tiger Shifter romance book by Lionel Law. Chapter 1. Rebecca ran a hand through her long, freshly washed hair, watching the dark tendrils slide and curl past her shoulders. The tips of it just barely grazing the skin beneath her breast. She stood in front of the bathroom cabinet, gazing at her reflection in the mirror as she prepared to leave her apartment in the city to travel to a wildlife sanctuary in upstate New York. She was going to be working there over the next several months. She studied her appearance critically, fingers brushing through her hair before she sighed and pulled her long, dark locks up into a ponytail. She scowled into the mirror as she noticed loose, frizzy strands already falling free of the clip. Oh well, she thought, I didn't study 8 years to get my master's in zoology to be glamorous. With that thought in mind, she pulled a gray tank top over her head, reaching for the white blouse her older sister Nancy sent for her 28th birthday. But I might as well make some effort on the first day, she thought, and shimmied into a pair of her nicest dark wash jeans. After giving herself another critical look in the mirror, she packed up her toiletries in the lavender duffel she was taking with her to the sanctuary. A normally conservative packer, Rebecca was planning on just bringing the basics with her to the accommodation they had provided at the sanctuary. She wasn't sure how long it would take her to complete the study of the habits for the rescued animals there, but she didn't want to take too much from her apartment in the city. That would just defeat the purpose of running away. She stopped, abruptly shaking her head. It's not running away, she reminded herself, it's just taking a break. Her sister had been the one to insist she take the job, claiming a change of scenery would be good for her. It's been over a year. Bex, you need to get over him, Nancy had told her over the phone last week. Don't call me that, Rebecca snapped. No one's called me that since I was 6. Yeah, or did Ryan call you that? At Rebecca's silence she pressed on. Look, I know it was a bad breakup, but you've had time. You've had nothing but time. I say you take the job, think of it like a vacation. And when you get back we'll see what we can do about getting you a man. I don't need a man to be happy, Nancy. She insisted. Nancy laughed. Sure, and I'll pretend I didn't see a brochure for the Happy Dreams adoption agency in your trash. Rebecca felt herself flush with embarrassment as she remembered that phone call with her sister. It was bad enough having Nancy privy to her year-long mope over Ryan, but to have her mock the ache she felt for a baby had hurt. She blamed Ryan really. He had been perfect. Tall, blonde hair, and the bluest eyes she had ever seen on a man. He had been understanding about her job and the long hours it forced her to keep. Well, at least she thought he had been understanding. Tucked into his arms late at night, he had spoken to her about marriage and how many kids he hoped they'd have. He painted the perfect fantasy before ripping it from her when his old college girlfriend stepped back into his life. Rebecca tightened her fingers around her duffel bag, hating that even after a year, thinking about Ryan still left her feeling gutted. She berated herself for letting the thought of him get her worked up. She had promised herself not do that anymore. Her future with Ryan was dead. Rebecca forced herself to start packing again, taking her favorite casual and working clothes. When she got to the bottom of her dresser, her fingers closed around the familiar, rough material of Ryan's flannel. Even after a year she was still finding pieces of him and their life together. Her fingers clenched, mauling the fabric in a sudden fit of anger as she wadded it up, tossing it into the wastebasket beside her dresser. This was why she took the job upstate. She needed time to get away and clear her head. She was tired of living with Ryan's ghost. When she finished packing her clothes, Rebecca booted up her laptop to double-check the address they had sent her. She winced when she noticed the 37 unread messages cluttering up her inbox. She scrolled through them quickly, trying to delete some of the worst ones. Free sperm donors. Looking for donors? Find one today. Preserve your sperm now. She groaned. She should have known requesting information from that sperm bank would be a bad idea. This was the third day her inbox was spammed. There goes checking my email at work, she thought. After checking the address, Rebecca powered down her laptop and slid it back into her duffel. She took one last look around her apartment. She couldn't help but remember Ryan and the coffee table they had picked out together. One of his cheesy crime novels tucked into the bookshelf next to her Jane Goodall collection. And even without opening it, Rebecca knew that inside the cupboard next to the stove, shoved all the way to the back, was a black coffee mug that he used for tea most mornings. No wonder she couldn't get over him. How could she when everything in her home seemed to be infected by him? I desperately need to redecorate when I get back, she thought. Pulling her Jeep Cherokee to a stop in front of the sanctuary's main office, Rebecca groaned as she finally got to stretch her legs. The drive may have only been a few hours, but for someone who spends most of their time outside, it was tortuous. Looking around, she felt excitement begin to build. The wildlife sanctuary had access to great land. The natural forest and sloping hills would make a great habitat for local animals. She smiled, feeling the wind on her hair and the sun on her cheeks before trying to tighten her ponytail and head inside. The scent of vanilla hit her as she stepped into the warm office, smiling at the plump, frazzled-looking woman who had a phone in one hand and was nervously twisting her hair with the other. She looked immensely relieved when she saw Rebecca step through the door. I'm sorry, Stacy, I'll have to call you back. Yes, the visiting zoologist just walked in, I'm sorry. Bye now. She set the phone down, releasing a long breath of air before smiling pleasantly. You are Rebecca, aren't you? Sorry to assume. We just weren't expecting anyone else out here today. Rebecca smiled politely, absently nodding her head as she took the opportunity to look around. Yes, I'm Rebecca Wilson. Are you all right? She motioned awkwardly to the phone and the woman's flustered appearance. She laughed good-naturedly. Oh, I'm fine. It's just getting close to our first school event. I get a number of calls from nervous parents every year around this time. Some of those mothers make it sound like we just opened the gates and chucked their kids in with the lions. That startled a laugh from Rebecca, who abruptly covered her mouth. I'm sorry, it must be difficult for you. The woman waved her off and typed something into the computer. Oh, you get used to it. My name's Maggie, by the way, I run the office here. You're actually a bit early. I don't think Luke's done with his rounds yet. He'll be the one showing you around. She explained. Do you have the forms we sent you? Wonderful, she said as Rebecca slid the completed paperwork over her desk. Well, you could wait here or you could go try to find him on your own. I think he might be in medical. You just go through that back door there and take a hard left. It's the first building. Thanks, Maggie, I'll see if I can find him, she said and pushed open the back door, turning to the left. The medical center wasn't hard to miss. The doors painted bright red, and Rebecca pushed them open, calling out, "Hello?" At first she thought she must have been in the wrong building because it was the most disused medical center she had ever stepped into. The equipment, exam tables, and holding cages looked brand new, but they were all empty. She didn't even see any staff. Hello? She called again, walking farther into the building. She barely held back a squeak when the doors directly in front of her were pushed open. The man who walked out was tall, somewhere in the 6-foot range if she had to guess. He had black hair that curled around his ears and at the base of his neck, and eyes the color of whiskey. It looked as if he hadn't shaved in a day or two. Not enough scruff to look sloppy, but just enough to make him look unkempt and wild. Wild? Rebecca thought frantically, trying to rein in her blush before it could take over her whole face. This isn't a Tarzan and Jane thing. Deep breath, don't be creepy. Hi, I didn't hear you come in, he said, and Rebecca took a moment to admire the strong shape of his jaw as he spoke. His voice was a little gruff but pleasant sounding, almost as if he didn't use it often. Sorry, she muttered, clearing her throat, I'm Rebecca Wilson. I'm the visiting zoologist, here to study the habitats you have here. Rebecca, he said, and she was a little more than embarrassed at the way she shuddered hearing that voice say her name. Rebecca, right, I remember Maggie saying something about you. He held out his hand for her to take. My name is Luke Wright, I guess I'll be showing you around today. She took his hand and tried not to focus on how warm he felt against her skin or how the rough patches on his hand caught against hers as she slowly slid it out of his grasp. It's nice to meet you. She found herself muttering again. The bundle she hadn't even realized he had been cradling in his left arm began to wiggle and she gasped. What's that? He laughed, a rough, pleasant sound, and adjusted the blankets until a small furry head poked out. The sandy-colored wolf pup looked about 10 weeks and a little small for its age. This is Henry. Rebecca felt herself frown. I didn't realize you bred the animals here. Luke shook his head. We don't encourage the animals to breed, but we don't stop them either. He laughed. Don't give me that look. I know what you're thinking, but we don't sell the offspring. They stay with their pack. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, it's just... He held up a hand, stopping her, a friendly smile on his face. It's all right. I understand your concern. There's a lot of places out there that abuse the system, breed their animals, and sell the offspring for profit. He put his hand on her upper arm, squeezing lightly. She could feel the warmth of his palm seeping through her shirt. We don't do that here. I'm pretty protective of the animals in my care. She nodded, trying to smile back at him. I'm sorry, I just hate when sanctuaries do that. His smile widened as he held her gaze. I do too. She cleared her throat, looking away from him as she felt her cheeks heating up. So why is Henry unethical? Luke's expression instantly changed, becoming more clinical. I had to separate him and his mother from the pack for the birth. I didn't really expect her to be able to bear pups. We rescued her from a private owner when she was 8 and she's been here for a year and a half. I didn't want to take any chances. She nodded and examined the pup Luke held in his arms. He looks healthy, a little small, but healthy. I'm just waiting until he gets a little bigger before I reintroduce them to the pack. He said, I'm surprised you're going to risk it at all with as much as this one's been handled. She said, motioning to the pup. I know a good zoo that would take him. No, he said harshly, then continued, softening his voice. The wolves won't reject one of their own. Right, well, I believe you're supposed to be showing me around today? He smiled almost sheepishly. I'll get him back to his mom and then we'll head out. He walked into the back with the pup, leading her out to the entrance of the sanctuary once he came back. He unlocked the gate and motioned her through, locking it behind them. The whole sanctuary is enclosed? She asked. Luke nodded, walking her out to a red and black ATV. Yeah. We have a big population of wolves that I'm pretty sure the locals don't want running through their backyards. He got into the driver's side. The gate we went through puts us in the wolf habitat. We also keep cougars, bobcats, coyotes, white-tailed deer, and a small herd of elk in here. It's our biggest habitat here at the sanctuary. Rebecca frowned. You keep all of them together? I know this is the biggest habitat, but that's a lot of predators per square mile. How do you control the infighting? How do you keep them from overkilling? The ATV rumbled to life as soon as she was settled, Luke guiding them onto a small dirt track leading into the forest. He glanced at her as he maneuvered around the deep ruts carved into the track, shrugging a little. The animals have their ways to keep the peace. She huffed and opened her mouth, but before she could ask another question, Luke accelerated. The ATV bouncing along the track and down a steep hill. This time Rebecca couldn't stop the squeak that flew out of her mouth, her fingers scrambling to find something to hang on to as Luke laughed, deep and rough. She felt goosebumps raise across her arms, but it was definitely from the near-death experience and not at all because of Luke. After a brief tour of the sanctuary's habitats, Luke pulled the ATV to a stop in front of a quaint, white brick building. This is where you'll be staying while you work here with us. It's fully furnished and I believe our cleaner put some basic groceries in the kitchen for you. He helped her out, not letting go of her hand until they were at the door of her temporary home. He slid the key into her hand. I'd give you the tour inside, but it's not that big. A slow smile spread over his face, and it would be pretty presumptuous of me to invite myself in. She couldn't stop the blush before it spread across her cheeks, cursing herself for getting flustered so easily. "It's okay. I mean, I wasn't thinking about." He laughed. "It's a joke. Sorry. I spend most of my time with the animals. I forget I'm not actually that funny. I should let you settle in and get to work. You'll find an ATV of your own around the side, keys on the kitchen counter." He gripped her shoulder. "I'll check on you later today. Find me if you have any questions. Maggie usually knows where I'm at." She thanked him and unlocked the door to her new home. She couldn't help sneaking a peek through the kitchen window to watch as Luke rode away, disappearing into the forest. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts as she ran back to her Jeep. It was thankfully not far from her accommodations, so she grabbed her duffel bag and headed back inside. She tried to calm down as she quickly unpacked her things, excited to get back out and start properly exploring the habitats. "I need to stop staring at Luke," she thought. "It doesn't matter if he's handsome. Poor guy probably thinks I'm a creep." Resolved to stop fussing like a middle schooler after their first crush, Rebecca finished unpacking and grabbed the keys to her ATV, driving back out to the wolf habitat. Once she parked her transportation somewhere she was fairly certain she'd remember where it was later, she grabbed her satchel and started surveying the land. The sanctuary was definitely strategically placed. The forested hills provided the perfect natural habitat for many of the animals under the sanctuary's care. There was even a natural river that flowed through the land. She knelt at the banks of the river, mud gushing around the knees of her good jeans as she bent to collect a water sample. She sighed. "Right. And this is why I don't wear nice clothes." Bottling the sample and tucking it away in her satchel, she started to rise to her feet, freezing when she heard sticks snapping and foliage rustling from across the riverbed. Whatever it was loud, and Rebecca thought back to what animals Luke said this habitat contained. Elk? She thought, then shook her head as she heard a deep growl, followed by the sound of something snuffling in the dirt. Okay, not an elk. She watched with wide eyes as a tall, young black bear lumbered out from the trees, the muscles on its legs and back rippling with each step it took towards the river. Yeah, so he didn't bother to mention the bears. Nice, she thought. She paused then frowned as she watched the bear lower its head to drink from the water. Wait, it's early November, that bear should have been in hibernation a month ago. Before she could slink away, the bear raised its head, looking right at her with warm, light brown eyes. She watched, her heartbeat slightly elevated as it snorted and ambled back the way it came. She couldn't help but feel angry as she tried to conclude her brief land survey. Luke could have mentioned they had bears, specifically bears out of hibernation that could be volatile. As she continued to survey the wolf habitat, her anger slowly turned into confusion. She may have seen a bear by the river, but the rest of the land showed no signs of them. No tracks, food sources, dens. She couldn't even find any droppings. There were no signs that any bears lived in this habitat. Once she concluded her survey, she drove the ATV back to her accommodations, pleased to see Luke already waiting for her. He smiled, lifting up a hand as she pulled up next to him. I'm glad you made it back okay. Our last visiting zoologist kept getting lost. Rebecca smiled tightly at him. Would you like to come in? I have a few questions. Luke followed her into the building, taking a seat at her little kitchen table. She made herself a quick cup of tea, feeling only a little guilty that she didn't offer him any. She sat across from him, warming her hands against the cup. You didn't mention the bear. Luke frowned. We don't have any bears. I saw a black bear by the river, about a mile from the wolves' den. Oh, that bear. He paused, and as his hand darted up to rub along the back of his neck, she found herself watching how the muscles in his arms and shoulders flexed and released. That bear climbs in the sanctuary sometimes from a grouping of close trees by one of the fences. He explained. And that's just okay? Look, I'm sorry, but I'm having a hard time understanding how things run here. By all means, this shouldn't work. It just shouldn't work, she repeated. How do you keep track of the animals? Luke shifted in his chair, his gaze not quite meeting hers. The animals have their routine, they know where they should be. She took in a calming breath. That doesn't even answer my question, she thought. How do you keep them from fighting between species or overkilling the prey? Listen, he reached across the table, covering one of her hands with his own. The animals, they have their ways. I understand you have a lot of questions. You're new, you don't know our way of doing things yet. Why don't we go out to eat tonight? We can celebrate your first day on the job and I'll answer whatever questions you want me to, I promise. That sounds wonderful, actually. I'd love to, she said. Great. The smile that spread across his face was wide and infectious. I have a few things to finish up, but I can come here to pick you up at 7? She nodded. I have a few things I need to finish too. He pushed himself up, his hands sliding off of hers. I'll see you in a few hours then. After he let himself out, Rebecca sat at the table until she could no longer hear his ATV. Springing up, she darted to the dresser she unpacked her duffel in, digging through the work and old, casual clothes she brought. Maybe I could have packed a bit more choices. Chapter 2. Rebecca stood in front of the full-length mirror hanging off the door of her wardrobe, holding shirt after shirt against her chest before chucking them onto the bed. She finally settled on a lilac-colored tank top and a simple, white button-up to go over the top. It'll have to do, she thought, and undid the first 3 buttons, allowing the lace of the tank top to be visible. Her gaze trailed down to her mud-splattered jeans and she sighed. Yeah, it really wasn't the brightest to wear my best pants on the job. She rustled through her dresser, finally pulling out a pair of black jeans, sliding them up her thighs. She studied her final look, shrugging her shoulders before deciding to tackle her hair. Pulling the long, dark locks from the hair tie, she visibly winced when the mane instantly began to curl and frizz. She quickly yanked it back into another tight ponytail. It's just going to have to stay like this then. She glanced at the time, her heart speeding up when she realized it was almost 7. It's been so long since I've been out with a man. She took in a deep, calming breath. Why am I freaking out? It's not even a date. It's just a dinner between colleagues. Yes, just dinner. I can do that, I can do dinner. She smoothed non-existent wrinkles out from her top, grabbing her purse before heading to the kitchen to wait for Luke. If she stood to the left of the sink, she could see the driveway. She wasn't there long before she could see the flash of headlights as Luke's truck made its way up her driveway. Before he could get out, she grabbed her keys and hurried out, locking the door behind her. She smiled as she pulled open the passenger side door and hopped inside. Hi, Luke smiled easily at her. Hi, he said and backed out. Heavy silence filled the cab of the truck as Rebecca watched the dark shadows of trees flicker outside the window as they drove past. This is awkward, isn't it? She finally asked and felt her cheeks growing warm as Luke's gruff, rumbling laugh filled the empty spaces in the cab. A little bit, he answered, but it doesn't have to be. How long have you been working as a zoologist? She smiled, relaxed this time. 4 years, ever since I graduated from university. She watched the strong outline of his profile as he listened to her answer. You went straight from school to work? He asked. Rebecca frowned, shifting in her seat. Oh, here we go. If there was one thing that ruined a potential relationship, it was when guys found out about her work ethic. Well, she calls it her work ethic, her exes tended to label it her obsession. I wanted to get started right away, she said, her lips pressed into a thin, irritated line. Luke glanced at her before turning his attention back to the road, the corner of his lips quirking up as he noticed her irritated posture. Sure, that's exactly what I did. She couldn't help the way her eyes darted to him in surprise. Really? Yeah. I've worked with animals my whole life, I couldn't wait to get paid to do it. He said. Rebecca blinked as the first light from the street lamps assaulted her eyes. She hadn't even realized they reached town yet. Luke pulled his truck in front of a small diner, the flashing sign in the window proclaiming that they were open 24 hours. She looked over to see Luke smiling sheepishly. I hope you don't mind, but they have the best burgers in town. Rebecca shook her head. No, this is perfect. Secretly she was relieved. She didn't have the wardrobe to eat somewhere more formal, and eating in pricier restaurants usually resulted in her spilling half the menu across her lap. She smiled and let Luke help her down from the truck, trying to repress a shiver at the biting November cold. She cursed internally as she realized she forgot to bring a jacket. Luke looked down at her, his eyebrows furrowing in concern, but she smiled quickly and walked briskly toward the entrance. Luke's long strides were quick to catch up to her, and he reached out, holding the door open. Rebecca nearly groaned when the wave of heat that escaped the building washed over them, chasing away the chill. She let Luke take her arm, guiding her towards a booth by the window. He slid into the seat across from her when she sat down. "You come here often then?" she asked after a pleasant-faced waitress had poured glasses of water and handed them menus. "Is it sad if I say yes?" He laughed. "I'm not much of a cook, I have to confess. I eat out more than I know I should." "I'm actually the same way," she confessed. "I'm not much good past boiling water. Well, let's hope we never have to host a dinner party together." That startled a giggle that she tried to smother into her palm, opening the menu to try and distract herself. She pored over the choices, debating whether or not she should try and impress by ordering a salad before immediately deciding against it and skimming the sandwich options. She was starving after her trek through the habitats. She briefly noticed that Luke hadn't touched his menu. Arching an eyebrow, she said, "Wow, you really do come here a lot, don't you?" Their waitress returned to the table, notepad in hand. "I'll have the double deal, steak fries if you could," Luke said, and she snorted. "I had that written down as soon as you opened the door." "What about you, sweetheart?" she asked Rebecca. "Oh, I'll just have the same please," she requested and looked back at Luke. "Don't look at me like that. Obviously you have the menu figured out." He tried to look put out but finally relented with a grin. All right. When I say I eat out more than I should, I mean I eat here most nights." She smiled around her water glass. "So how long have you been working at the sanctuary?" 6 years this spring." "Wow," she murmured, impressed. "You must have great relationships with the animals." Luke smiled, almost too quickly. "You could say that. So what made you decide to come work out here?" Rebecca focused on her water glass with renewed interest, trying not to think of Ryan. "I just needed a change of scenery. A break from everything at home." "Any family?" he asked. "Just my sister, Nancy, and her family. I have 3 little nieces." Her heart hurt thinking of the 3 little blondes framed in pictures pinned all over her fridge. "How long until I can have something like that?" she thought. Luke seemed to sense her sadness and thankfully changed the subject to pets. Her apartment didn't allow any, but she learned that he had a border collie mix named Bear. By the time their food came, Luke had regaled her with tales of Bear's mischief and she forgot all about the longing for a child. Her eyes grew wide as their waitress set down 2 identical plates, heaped with food. Apparently a double deal was a double cheeseburger with a mountain of fries. "I don't think I can eat all this. I can help you." Luke mumbled through a bite of burger and she laughed as she watched him twist a fry through a pile of ketchup, stuffing it in his already full mouth. "I'm starting to see that," she said, trying to smother another laugh. Once she finished her meal, once she ate all she could and then Luke cleaned her plate, their waitress brought them the check. Luke dug his wallet from his pocket. "I'll get it." Rebecca shook her head. "No way, we'll split it. Besides, you drove me out here, so I should owe you for gas anyway." Luke frowned at her for several long seconds. "If we go out to eat again, I get to pay." She laughed, knowing that was unlikely. "Fine." She looked outside, dreading the walk to the truck as she eyed the frost forming across the windshield. Luke shrugged into his flannel coat, looking down at her with a small frown. "You didn't bring a jacket?" he asked, and when she shook her head he motioned her to stand, slipping it off and draping it around her shoulder. "Here, take this. Can't have you freezing on your first night here." "No, I couldn't. You just have a t-shirt, I have long sleeves," she said, but even as she spoke she clutched the flannel tighter around her, relishing in the warmth. "It's fine, I run warm anyway," he said and pressed a firm hand to the small of her back, gently guiding her out of the diner and back to the truck. He ducked his head a little as he opened the door and helped her into the passenger seat. Rebecca frowned as she felt a hot puff of air across the back of her neck. "He couldn't. Is he smelling me?" But as soon as she began to tense he was pulling away, a smile on his lips as he shut the door for her. "I must be going crazy. Either that or I really should have taken that shower before going out." The drive back was filled with a comfortable silence. Even though it was only nearing 9, Rebecca could feel her head starting to nod as she tried to stay awake. It was getting harder and harder to keep her eyes open between the fullness in her stomach and the warmth of Luke's flannel encompassing her. She must have fallen asleep because when she opened her eyes next they were pulled up outside her home. Luke's hand was curled around her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "We're here, Rebecca?" She hummed and tried to blink herself awake. "Yeah, sorry." She felt his hand slip around her waist, steadying her as she went to hop out of the truck. "I'm just going to go in now." He smiled at her fondly, watching to make sure she made it inside before he left. Rebecca felt foggy and exhausted as she stumbled around her bedroom, trying to get ready for bed. She breathed a sigh of relief as she finally let her hair out of the tie, the long, dark locks spilling down her shoulders. She stripped down to her underwear, throwing an old t-shirt over her head before crawling onto the mattress. She silently thanked housekeeping for making up the bed before she arrived today because as tired as she was, she didn't think she'd have the energy to make up a bed. She drifted to sleep thinking of about a pair of whiskey-colored eyes, Luke's face morphing into the bear's as she dreamed. She never realized that Luke kept her talking and laughing all night and she never got the chance to question him about the sanctuary. When she woke that morning, she didn't remember any of her strange dreams. She slid a soft pair of pajama bottoms up her legs and padded into the kitchen to see what the housekeeping staff had left her for food. Walking past the door, she noticed that someone had slid a small pile of mail under it. "That was fast. I'm glad I forwarded it a week in advance." She scooped up her mail, flicking through the envelopes as she made her way into the kitchen. She frowned when she came to an envelope with her sister's familiar scrawl. "Why would she be sending me a letter?" Quickly ripping into it, she brushed her fingers across the smooth gloss of the Christmas pictures. Her sister always sent themed Christmas photos to the family and this year her 3 little nieces were dressed as reindeer. She read the elegant script on top of the card, "Happy Holidays from all 6 of us." She frowned and read the words over again. 6? Her breath caught as she finally noticed the soft swell of her sister's stomach beneath the garish green of her Christmas sweater. She could do nothing to stop the rising jealousy, wadding up the Christmas pictures in a fit of rage and tossing them towards the garbage. She stormed back into her bedroom, digging out her phone and shooting her sister a quick text. "Bit soon for Christmas cards, isn't it?" Agitated and appetite lost, Rebecca headed into the shower, hoping the hot water would soothe her. Standing under the gentle stream of warm water, she found her thoughts drifting towards Luke. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time and it was nice to share a meal with someone else for once. She thought of his eyes, warm and the color of whiskey, and the way his hand curled around her shoulder or the firm press of his palm against her back and felt heat pool in her belly. She chewed lightly on her lower lip as the slit of soap across her wet skin grew more lingering. She groaned softly and pushed her face against the stream of water pouring from the shower head. "This can't be happening. I can't be getting a crush on him. We work together." She started running through the tasks she wanted to get done today, firmly shaking any thoughts of Luke from her mind. Refreshed from her shower, Rebecca slipped into her work clothes. This time she made sure to put on her old jeans, knowing they'd probably just get destroyed anyway. On her way out, she went to grab for her thick, brown coat but she stopped, noticing Luke's flannel thrown over one of her kitchen chairs. "Would it be weird if I wore that today?" She hesitated before shrugging it over her shoulders. "Screw it, it's the warmest piece of clothing in this house. I'll just return it this afternoon once it warms up." She had to push the sleeves up and wrap the tie tightly around her waist to avoid looking like she was swimming in all the excess material. Pulling her wet hair up into a ponytail, she grabbed the keys to the ATV and locked the door behind her. Today she wanted to check the habitats of the exotic animals, so she guided her ATV down the rough track that led to the other habitats. During her tour with Luke the day before, she had been impressed by the level of thoughtfulness displayed by the habitats. They were obviously lovingly designed, and she had never seen habitats that allowed the animals so much extra room to roam. Pulling up in front of the lion habitat, Rebecca could see the male lion pacing, agitated in front of the gate. He was big, the sheer size of him indicating his good health, and his golden mane thick and long. She dug in her satchel for the charts that Maggie had forwarded her in an email. She scanned through the information quickly. The lion habitat was one of the smaller ones in the sanctuary. It included 1 male and 2 female lions and, she paused, a hippo? She double-checked the chart. No, it definitely says there's a hippo in there with them. She flipped through the chart to get to the maps of the habitats, noting that there was a small, man-made lagoon inside the lion exhibit. This is crazy. Lions have been known to hunt hippos and rhinos. She thought, I know these 3 were bred in captivity, but that doesn't erase their hunting instinct. I need to get in there and make sure they haven't already killed it. She shoved the chart back into her satchel, her mind already filling with images of the hippo sickly, and forced to spend every hour in the water to avoid the lions. She watched the lion pacing in front of the gate and knew what she was about to do was extremely dangerous. These animals didn't know her yet, and this one was already extremely agitated. Her only hope was to sneak through the back gate and check on the hippo before this one realized she was inside his habitat. So as calmly as she could, she got back onto the ATV and drove around to the back gate. She got out, grabbing the ring of keys and letting herself in through the back gate. According to the map, the lagoon was in the back left corner, meaning that if she just followed the fence she should run right into it. She kept her footsteps light and her breath controlled, trying to survey the habitat as best she could as she walked briskly towards the lagoon. This was one of the few roofed habitats, probably due to the snow that the sanctuary got in the winter. She could hear the soft buzz of the ventilation shafts pumping warm air into the habitat. She'd have to talk to someone about walling in the front of the habitat. It didn't make any sense to have the front open for all the warm air to escape. She might suggest they get some heat lamps installed so the lions can simulate sunning themselves. As she walked along, she grew more impressed by the quality of the habitat. They did a good job thinning the trees so the animals wouldn't feel too enclosed, and she even saw big patches of African tall grass that someone had planted in the soft, upturned dirt. She saw the lagoon long before she reached it, her strides quickening to reach the beautiful, man-made body of water. The ground dipped and was filled with a massive pool of endless dark water, tall reeds rising from the banks. The hippo was standing ankle-deep in the shallow water by the banks, crunching a mouthful of reeds in its massive jaw. It doesn't look hurt or stressed, she thought, and frowned when she spotted one of the 2 female lions. Her long, lithe body was stretched out along a rock, maybe 4 feet from the lagoon. It was directly under one of the vents. Her tail was flicking from side to side as she regarded Rebecca. She made no move to get up, however, her posture remained relaxed as she soaked up heat from the vent. Still, Rebecca slowly moved closer to the wall, her hand brushing across the yellow-green bark of an African fever tree that stretched its long, low branches across the dark water of the lagoon. As she turned to make the quick trip back to the gate, the black tip of a soft tail slipped from the branch above her and grazed her cheek. Gazing up, she met a pair of amber-colored eyes. The leopard's tail flicked again, brushing across her lips, and she took a startled step back. Except, she forgot how close she was to the gentle slope of the lagoon, and she squeaked as her boot slid back in the mud. Her arms flailed as she felt her body wobbling back and forth towards the water, her eyes closing as she prepared for the rush of water to surround her. Before her body could fall back into the dark water, she felt something snag Luke's flannel, yanking her forward. Her eyes snapped open at the change in momentum, and she nearly shrieked when she saw the claws retracting from the front of Luke's flannel. The leopard stared at her, seemingly uninterested, as he brought his paw back to lick lazily as his tail flicked between them. She stumbled away from him and towards the back gate, hardly noticing how badly her hands were trembling. All the animals have gone crazy today, she thought as she made a hasty retreat. Nothing behaves the way it should in this place. She tried to get her breath under control, fiddling with her hair to try to stop the shaking of her hands. In her 4 years working with exotic animals, this was the first time that Rebecca had ever been truly afraid. When she finally reached the gate, her mood turned again. Great. This is exactly what I needed to finish my morning off. The male lion that had been pacing in the front of the habitat must have heard all the noise she had made back at the lagoon because he was now standing in between her and the gate. She made sure her posture remained casual. It wouldn't do for the agitated animal to see her tensing. She stayed still as the restless creature watched her. She knew that just remaining calm and still was the best thing she could do right now. Hopefully, he wouldn't deem her as a threat and lose interest. The longer she stayed where she was, the more restless he seemed to get, and she lifted her foot to take a small, slow step back. Hopefully, he would let her retreat to the front gate. The lion zeroed in on her sudden movement, a deep, rumbling growl echoing from his chest. She could see his muscles tensing, preparing to charge or pounce. Her heart picked up like a hummingbird's, and she had the sudden realization that she could die here. A hand grabbed the back of her flannel, yanking her back, and she vaguely recognized that Luke had just taken her place in front of the lion. His clothes were rumpled, looking hastily thrown on, and his black curls were wild around his head. "Hey," he shouted firmly, his posture tall and aggressive. "You get back." Now Rebecca knew they were going to die, except, to her amazement, the lion snarled once, and as Luke held his ground it seemed to deflate, slinking off towards the lagoon. As soon as it was out of sight, Luke spun around, his large, warm hands cupping her face. "Are you all right?" Chapter 3. "Rebecca, are you all right?" he repeated. She let out a shaky breath. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm fine." Luke frowned. "What were you doing in here?" I wanted to check on the hippo." Luke's gaze softened, his expression understanding. "Rebecca, you have to trust me when I tell you that we don't have any animals together that can't be together." "But, why don't you take lunch early? Drink a whole pot of tea, okay?" he suggested with a small smile, and pressed a firm kiss to her forehead before releasing her completely. Head spinning and breath short, Rebecca let Luke guide her out to her ATV. He urged her to go home and take lunch before disappearing back into the lion habitat, leaving her alone and feeling lost. Rebecca did go back home to take lunch early, but she didn't drink a whole pot of tea like Luke suggested. She only drank half. The longer she sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped firmly around her mug, the more she thought she was blowing things out of proportion. She just wasn't expecting a leopard in the habitat. That's what had spooked her. Also, it must have been a branch that snagged the flannel. There was no way the leopard had actually pulled her away from the lagoon. It must have been a trick played by her frightened mind. And of course the lion would back down, she thought. Luke's probably been working with him all 6 years he's been here. So the more she thought about it, the more she decided that her reaction had been silly. She had no reason to be frightened. Obviously, the charts Maggie had sent her were out of date. She'd have to ask Luke for updated versions so she didn't have any more unexpected encounters. Trying to distract herself, she flipped on her phone, frowning when she saw that her sister had replied to her message. "I forgot I even sent that. Bitter much?" Rebecca scowled and typed out a reply. "Are we 4? She sighed after she sent it, knowing that fighting with her sister wasn't going to make her feel any better. The truth was, she was bitter. Bitterness and jealousy still rose within when she thought about the 3 blonde heads, big, toothy smiles, and the soft swell of her sister's abdomen. She finally relented after her second cup of tea and smoothed the wrinkles from the Christmas pictures, pinning them to her small refrigerator. She snapped a quick picture and sent it to her sister with a caption, "There's still a lot of blank space. You might need to send more," knowing it would be enough to soothe her sister's irritation. After she finished her 3rd cup of tea and the last of her cheese sandwich, she was ready to get back to work and find Luke. Climbing onto the ATV, she drove to the medical center, having an inkling where she would find him. When she walked into the private holding cells and saw Luke cradling Henry the wolf pup, she had to stop and admire the moment. Her treacherous brain replacing the image with one of Luke cradling a baby like that, a baby with dark locks and amber-colored eyes. She quickly stopped the fantasy before it could go any further, clearing her throat. Luke turned to face her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Hello, this place hasn't scared you off yet then?" "I don't get scared off easily. I just wanted to find you and apologize. I usually don't freeze up like that and act so unprofessional. I got startled by a leopard. I think the noise attracted the lion," she said. "I wanted to ask if I could get some of the updated charts from you. I think Maggie sent me the old ones. It didn't have the leopard on it." "Oh, right. You don't really have to worry about that. All the information you have is up to date. We just got the leopard this morning." Really? She arched a brow, because he seemed pretty settled into me. Well, you know, he focused his attention on the wolf pup in his arms. That one's pretty lazy, he answered vaguely. She sighed. I don't even know what to believe anymore. So other than the lazy leopard, everything else in my charts is up to date? She asked, only a little bit sarcastic. Luke nodded. I was hoping that this afternoon you could help me with something. Of course, anything. One of our tigers hasn't been eating. I could use an extra hand while I take a look at her. He said. How old is it? She asked. She's 12. Let me put him back and I'll take you out to the habitat. He said and stroked a hand down the fur along Henry's back before unlocking the holding cage and settling him back inside with his mother. He pressed a hand to Rebecca's lower back, guiding her out of the medical center and out back to his truck. She could feel the heat of it burning through the fabric of his flannel. He drove her out to the tiger habitat. Rebecca remembered reading in the charts that they had 6 Siberian tigers, all rescued from private owners. She hesitated as he unlocked the front gate and he turned, the side of his mouth twisting up as he saw her hesitation. They'll be fine with you if you go in with me, he said, and she nodded slowly, stepping up close behind him as he opened the gate. The tigers were spread out in the habitat, but the one closest to the gate was obviously ill. The tiger was laying on her side, her stomach distended with bloat, her breath shallow and too quick. Rebecca felt any lingering fear she had disappear as her brain whirred into clinical mode. She knelt next to the sick animal, gently palpating her stomach. We need to get her to the medical center. I'd like to start some imaging. You have ultrasound equipment? She asked. Luke nodded. I'll sedate her. I have a holding cage in the back of the truck. Can you set up the ramp? We'll have to wheel her into the bed. Rebecca agreed, and together they set to complete their tasks. She was surprised by how seamless they worked together, Luke sedating the tiger as she prepared to transfer her. The ride back to the medical center was tense, Luke's fingers tight around the wheel. Has she been here long? She asked softly. 6 years, we got her a month after I started working here. He answered. She was starving. I had to force feed her, formula, a couple milliliters every hour for 24 hours. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. I know I'm too attached. I always get attached. That's not a bad thing, Luke. Rebecca told him, and then they were back at the medical center and she was helping him with the ramp to roll the tiger's cage out of the bed of the truck and into the examination room. Together they transferred her onto one of the long tables and Rebecca set up the ultrasound machine. She shaved a patch of the tiger's fur to get better access to the soft, pink skin and pressed the wand against her belly. They saw it at the same time, the gray mass of tumor that was currently blocking her lower intestine. She heard Luke release a long rush of breath as she zoomed in on the image, taking several stills. So that's it then, she heard him say softly. You'll need to call someone in to do a consultation for surgery. I can't do it, Luke. I'm sorry, she said and slowly turned off the machine. Luke smoothed the ruffled fur back into place, fingers scratching down the side of the tiger's neck. Yeah, I'll let Maggie know. She has our list of approved people. She can get her transferred somewhere. She helped him get the tiger comfortable in a holding cage a safe distance away from the wolf and her pup, frowning as his mood grew more solemn. She knew that look in his eyes. He was falling deeper into his own thoughts. It wasn't his fault, but he couldn't see that yet. When they finished in the medical center, she could see him hovering, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving the tiger. Could you show me to the giraffe habitats? I really wanted to start surveying the land you've been using, she said. Luke's attention snapped back to her. Of course. Do you want to use your ATV or my truck? Truck, please. It's much warmer, she answered, and his answering smile was small, but it was progress. In the next 3 weeks that followed, Rebecca worked with Luke nearly every day. She could have worked by herself. Her job was designed for independent work after all, but neither one of them seemed to want to part. She had successfully surveyed the 3 of the habitats at the sanctuary, the giraffes, tigers, and lions, and was pleased to see some of the animals starting to respond to her presence. She didn't know how, but she knew that her easy acceptance had something to do with Luke. Thinking of the man brought a rush of heat, and she pressed ice-cold fingers against her cheeks, trying to quell the burn. The attraction that she felt for him had done nothing but grow the longer she spent in his presence. It was the way he held himself, completely at ease and yet in control. The animals respected him. Hell, she thought almost bitterly. They treat him as if he's their alpha. She couldn't stop watching him. The longer they worked together, the more her eyes were drawn to him, watching the way he worked with the animals and demanded their respect so easily. Today, she and Luke had to reintroduce Henry the wolf pup and his mother back to the pack. She still wasn't sure how she felt about it, but she's learned to trust Luke. If he said they would accept them back in, then they would. She jolted as she hit another deep rut on her ATV. She was supposed to be meeting Luke in the wolf habitat at 10, but she was a little early. She was never good with late mornings. She didn't understand how he could sleep as late as he did. As she drove, her thoughts wandered and she wondered if she'd be able to sleep in later if it was Luke lying next to her. She shook her head as if trying to physically dispel the thoughts. Even if nothing was going to come of her crush, she could at least be thankful that in her time at the sanctuary they had become close friends. A flash of dark fur to her left had her hand falter on the accelerator and the ATV lurched to a stop beneath her. The howl sounded in front of her, long and haunted, and rose goosebumps along the flesh of her arms. The next she saw, a black-furred wolf was stepping gingerly out onto the road, the yellow in its eyes glinting, breath coming out in soft clouds against the chill of the morning air. They regarded each other, blue eyes locked with amber. And suddenly the wolf was moving again, plunging back into the forest and disappearing into the net of thickening trees. She released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding as a disturbing thought popped up in her mind. There are no black wolves in this habitat. Shaken, she quickly got the ATV moving again, driving through the twisted forested path to their meeting point. When she got to the little clearing, Luke wasn't there yet, so she used the time to go through the wolves in her mind. Being here for nearly a month, she knew most, if not all, of the wolves by sight. They were all sandy-colored. Not a single one she could think of was black. They didn't even have a brown one. Luke would have told me if they were getting a new one. Hell, I would have seen it before he released it into the habitat, she thought. As she waited in the clearing, the crunch of cold soil under a boot drew her gaze toward a patch of trees, and she visibly startled when a man she didn't recognize emerged. The first thing she noticed was his piercing green eyes and the short, almost military cut of his light brown hair. He was dressed in hardy blue jeans, tall hiking boots laced up his calves, and a black trench coat that fell past his knees. "Excuse me, how did you get in here? This is an enclosed habitat for Agent Wilson, FBI," he interrupted, flashing a badge too quick for her to read. "I'm looking for a man who may be going by the name of Luke Wright." She opened her mouth to tell him that she worked with Luke and that he'd be along shortly before snapping it closed again. Doubt building in her mind. This doesn't feel right, she thought. This guy just suddenly walks out of the trees claiming to be FBI? How did he even get in? She frowned and took a step back towards the ATV, fingers gripping the fabric of her satchel where her phone lay. "Look, I don't care who you say you're with. You don't have any right to be in here. It's not safe for my animals, it's not safe for you. And unless you can provide some sort of warrant or other document within the next 5 seconds, I'm going to need you to leave." Agent Wilson kept her stare for a long moment before scowling. "I'll just see myself out if you aren't going to cooperate." She shook her head. "I can't let you just wander around in here. I'll drive you out myself and get someone to escort you off the premises." For a moment it looked like he was going to fight her on it, but after a few seconds he nodded, almost to himself. When he looked back at her, he was wearing a cold smile. "Thank you, I never got your name." She climbed into the ATV, turning on the engine. "I never gave it." When he walked closer towards her, she could see a strap and the tip of dark steel poking over his shoulder. "I think that's a shotgun." She could feel her muscles tense as he climbed into the ATV, laying the gun across his lap. "That's definitely a shotgun." Her mouth opened to speak, she couldn't stop herself. "Do FBI always go around packing shotguns like that?" His lips twisted into a smirk. "Special case," was all he said. Rebecca didn't waste any more time, pushing the limits of the little ATV as she drove him towards the entrance of the habitat. It unnerved her the way he stared, deep green eyes locked on her face. He didn't even try to hide it. He kept the gun across his lap, fingers wrapped around the cool metal. She could see flashes of dark fur between the trees and occasionally get a glimpse of glowing, amber eyes. This time it didn't scare her though. She almost felt a little better knowing something was with her. Halfway back, she decided to dig out her phone and call Maggie up in the front office. The man, Agent Wilson, hadn't said a word to her since getting into the ATV, just stared. Coming to the conclusion that he was less likely to be FBI and more likely to be some sort of crazed serial killer, she decided he might be less likely to murder her if she were on the phone. Of course, she did have the strange black wolf that had apparently been following her around the habitat, but with the way her morning had been going, she wasn't going to trust in anything. I hope Luke isn't there waiting for me, she thought. She dialed the number with one hand, the other trying to keep them on the road. It rang several times before Maggie answered, sounding breathless and frazzled, but that was how she normally sounded. Hello? Hi, Maggie, it's Rebecca. I was just calling to ask if you could radio one of the maintenance guys and ask them to meet me in front of the wolf habitat. She said. Of course, I can. Why? We don't have another breach in the fence, do we? She asked, sounding worried. No, I just have a guest that I need to have escorted off the premises. I'd do it, but I'm supposed to be meeting Luke now. She explained. A guest? She asked, humming. Is this an unwanted guest? Rebecca glanced at the agent, trying to gauge whether or not he could hear Maggie's loud voice over the phone, but he kept his expression cold and disinterested. Yes, she finally said. A hunter? Maggie asked, all the warmth gone from her tone. I'm not sure, maybe? I'm sorry, Maggie, could you just radio someone? I'm almost to the gate. Of course. You be careful now. Oh, and stop by and see me in the office sometime. I'll make you the best cup of coffee you've ever had. Rebecca smiled a little against the phone. I will, bye Maggie, thanks. True to Maggie's word, once Rebecca pulled through the gate, there was a man she vaguely recognized from maintenance waiting for them. She stopped the ATV but didn't get out. Hi, thanks for coming out of your way to do this, she said, but he was already shaking his head, looking sternly at the agent seated next to Rebecca. No need to thank me, Miss Rebecca, he said. Just Rebecca, please, and make sure you see him all the way off the property, she said, and he nodded, waiting impatiently for the agent to pull himself out of the seat. If he was also intimidated by the shotgun, he didn't show it. Agent Wilson locked eyes with her. I will be seeing you again. Not unless you have a warrant. Or a badge I can actually read, she said, and almost burst out laughing at the expression on his face. Obviously he wasn't used to being spoken to like that. He slung the shotgun across his shoulder and started walking without a word, black trench coat flapping around his knees like an overgrown bat. The man from maintenance was quick to follow him out, and when he was no longer in sight, Rebecca let out a long rush of air. In all my life, I have never worked in a place with as much drama and danger as this one. I wouldn't be surprised if it's making me go gray, she thought, and absent-mindedly touched her hair. That's all my sister needs is one more thing to gloat over. The drive back into the wolf habitat was much less tense, and this time, she didn't see the new wolf anywhere. When she arrived back at the clearing, Luke was already there, sitting in his parked truck. She could see a holding cage in the back and knew the adult wolf was in there, and knowing Luke, the pup was probably inside his truck with him. Just as she thought, when he got out, he was holding Henry in his arms, fingers scratching the scruff of his neck. She almost giggled as she took in his appearance. He looked rumpled, his clothes hanging off him in disarray and his hair tousled. Late morning? She teased. He grumbled a little. Yes, haha, I notice you're quite a bit late too though. Want to explain that? She almost did. She almost told him everything that had happened to her this morning, but something stopped her. She didn't know why, but she felt like she should keep the encounter between the agent and herself a secret, at least for now. I doubt he was even a real agent. Maggie mentioned hunters on the phone. I bet he's not the first local to break in and try to get one of our elk. So she decided to keep quiet about it. Just for now, she told herself. However, deep down, A little voice was telling her that she knew exactly why she didn't want to tell him. She was afraid there would be some truth to Agent Wilson, that he really was after Luke, and that Luke was in trouble. She wanted to protect him from that if it was true, at least for now. It's probably nothing anyway, she kept telling herself, just a hunter thinking he could sneak in and out without getting caught. So she smiled at Luke. I got a little caught up with the new black wolf no one bothered to tell me about. Want to explain that? Chapter 4. Luke at least had the decency to look a little sheepish as he looked her in the eyes and lied. We don't have any new wolves. He told her. Yes, we do. I saw a black one this morning. It was following me in my ATV. It even ran right in front of me. You and I both know that there are no black wolves in this habitat. Are you sure it wasn't just in the shadows? That it just looked a darker color? He asked. She huffed. I think I know how to tell the color of fur, even in the shadows. She said, her voice rising a little. Henry let out a loud yip in Luke's arms and Rebecca had never seen him look so relieved. Right, well, we can figure that out later. Right now we need to get these two taken care of. Rebecca knew he was right, but she never liked to leave an argument unfinished. Another quality that she was sure didn't help her keep any boyfriends. Fine, but we're going to talk about this later. Don't think I'm going to forget. Luke smiled at her fondly. Believe me, I know you won't. He said, and she almost got caught up in his eyes before shaking herself off. Okay, you're more familiar with the pack than I am. You take the lead, I'll follow. They got to work, moving seamlessly together as they got the ramp up and transferred the holding cage from the truck to flat ground. The wolf in the cage raised her lips in a snarl as she saw Rebecca but seemed to calm when Luke moved into her line of sight. Shush, he soothed the wolf. We'll have you out and with your family in a moment. So, what are we waiting for? She asked. The pack, he answered shortly. They come through here every day. What? She asked. You can't be serious. We're better to reintroduce them to the habitat than by using the pack. He told her. You're not worried that they'll reject her and the pup? She asked. He shook his head. I know these wolves, they won't reject their own. As he finished speaking they could hear the wolf pack approaching. The soft crunch of their paws against the cold ground and fallen leaves. Luke sprang into action, opening the door to the holding pen and gently guiding the wolf out. He held the pup in one arm as they waited for the other wolves to show themselves. The first one emerged from the tree line slowly, gray head bent and ears pressed flat against his head. The others came out of the trees, forming a half circle behind the leader. Rebecca stayed where she was, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. She had never seen wolves behave like the ones in this sanctuary did. They acted as if they were taking part in a trade, ignoring her completely with their eyes locked on Luke. Luke, for his part, looked completely calm while standing in a clearing half surrounded by wolves. He even smiled and began to greet them by name. Bucky, he addressed the leader of the pack, his voice fond yet firm. You and your boys just stay where you are. He placed a hand on the back of the mother wolf's head, firmly guiding her towards the group. She walked the rest of the way to the group with ease and the pack leader, or Bucky as Luke called him, pressed the black tip of his nose into her neck. He huffed softly as he scented her and a low growl rumbled from in his chest. Rebecca felt her heart thump loudly, expecting the worst, but the wolf did nothing as the mother walked past him and greeted the rest of the pack. Luke turned and smiled at her. That was the easy one, he said and walked up to Bucky, paying no mind to the snarl on his lips and set Henry down right in front him, in the sight line of his mother. Rebecca moved before she could stop herself and wrapped her hands around his arm as the wolf snarled and growled at the pup. Luke put his arm around her waist, drawing her close against him. She took comfort in the strong arm steadying her and the gentle whisper against her ear telling her, "It's going to be fine, Rebecca." In that moment she believed him and watched as the pack leader nosed roughly at Henry, knocking the pup over in his attempt to scent him. The wolf pushed his nose into the soft fur covering the pink belly and then was pulling away, letting the pup run back to his mother. The wolves didn't stay long after that, disappearing together into the trees. As her breathing slowed, Rebecca realized they were still clutching each other. Her chest constricted tightly as she looked up at his face, feeling strange about the look she saw there. The air between them had changed from one of relief to something charged and tense. One of his hands came up and brushed across her cheek. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I've just never." She trailed off, not knowing how to explain that she thought all of his methods were crazy and that there was nothing technical or by the book how he worked at all. "I know it's a little unconventional, but it's the way I've always done things and it works," he said. "I think you take a lot of risks." She finally said. "Maybe," he answered, "but it always works out." "It might be working for you now, Luke, but they're animals. You can't always predict how they're going to react and you can't control them," she said, and for a moment it looked like he was going to argue with her before finally just shaking his head, looking at her fondly. She was starting to hate that look. The one that said she didn't understand, but that's okay because she was cute. "Not that I think that Luke thinks that I'm cute," she quickly thought. "You still need to tell me about that wolf. The black one that I saw this morning." "Listen, I'm not sure what you saw, but we don't have any black wolves. We don't have any new wolves. And even if we had a breach in the fences, there aren't any wolves in the local area." "I know what I saw, Luke." "Then I don't know what to tell you because I can guarantee you that there are no new wolves in this habitat," he said, and before she could press him for more answers he took her hands in his. She quickly forgot what she was going to say, with her hands wrapped up in his warm, large ones. Her eyes locked on his, warm and brown. This was the first time that she was close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his eyes, giving them the golden brown, whiskey color. "I want to take you out to dinner tonight, if that's all right with you," he said. "I'd really like that, Luke." He smiled at her, thumb tracing a pattern on the back of her hand. "But this time I want to take you out as my date, not as my colleague," he continued, and Rebecca could swear that her heart stuttered to a stop. She knew that she hadn't exactly been subtle with her crush on him, but she never imagined that he would notice her in that way. "I would love, that would be, yes. Yes, I would love to go on a date with you," she finally managed to say, thankful that he wasn't laughing. "Great. Same time as last time? 7? He asked. She nodded. "That sounds great. Okay, I'll pick you up at 7. He smiled and bent to brush his lips over her cheek. "I have to get that cage back to medical and then I have a few things to do, but I'll see you tonight," he said. Rebecca moved to help him heave the cage up the ramp and back into the truck, but to her amazement, Luke was able to manhandle it in by himself. He put away the ramp and climbed into the truck, waving to her before driving off towards the back entrance of the habitat. So she was left there, standing alone in a clearing, her heart thudding in her chest and a blush spreading across her cheeks. It took her a moment to get her thoughts together and climb back into the ATV, driving down to where the giraffes were kept. She let herself into their enclosure, her hands finding their way down their soft fur. They knew her by now and let her stroke down the fur on their chests. The rhythmic petting soothing her worries and giving her mind some time to catch up with everything that had happened today. She could feel her nerves rising as she thought about going on a date with Luke. She hadn't been on a real date since the early days of her and Ryan's disastrous relationship, and she could only hope that this one would turn out a little better. She really liked Luke. There was something about him that felt different, but it wasn't necessarily a bad different. The more she thought about it, the more she couldn't help but think that a relationship between them could be so good. He shared her passion for working with animals, and while his methods may be more based on feelings and intuition than hers of procedures, they still shared a love for the work. She could picture them together so easily, and more than that, she could picture starting a family with him. Whoa, slow down, she told herself. You cannot go talking about starting families and babies on a first date. Shoving the thoughts of babies and first dates from her mind, she got ready to work. She still had 6 hours before he was going to pick her up and a long list of tasks to be completed. When she arrived at her home after finishing as much work as she could, she set out to prepare for her date. She willed herself not to panic because technically she had been out with Luke before, but this felt a lot different. At least her good jeans had been washed since she went out in the woods in them, and the mud hadn't even stained. She slid the jeans on, debating tops before pulling out her nice lilac blouse. She hadn't really packed any nice clothes for dates, not expecting to go on any, but she told herself not to worry. Luke asked her out after having seen all of her dull but comfortable work clothes, so anything she could wear with some color was a step up from that. Dressed, she prepared herself for the hardest task of the night, taming her curls. She refused to have her hair up in a ponytail for this date, no matter how long it was going to take to comb and fuss her dark locks into submission. Luckily, she must have been thinking ahead when she packed, because right beside her vanity was her one and only styling product, a canister of extra-strength mousse. Getting her hair damp in the sink, she started to work the mousse through her fizzy, brushed-through curls. The end result was surprisingly pretty, her dark hair glossy and shining with thick curls that swept past her shoulders. Unlike her usual curls, these ones were obviously styled, sleek, and no frizz in sight. She applied a light touch of makeup, never having been one to mess with it much save for special occasions, and grabbed Luke's flannel hanging off the knob of her bedroom door without a second thought. She slipped it on and fixed her hair over the collar. She thought. If this date goes well, I might not ever have to give his coat back. Not that I had considered giving it back anyway. She took her customary spot by the kitchen window, not letting herself think about how creepy it was, and waited to see the headlights of his truck as it twisted its way up her driveway. She was out the door as soon as she saw the first flash of light, grateful for Luke's flannel against the freezing air outside. It was getting colder and colder as December neared, edging toward the type of cold that made your teeth ache and breathing uncomfortable. It's amazing it hasn't really snowed yet. Usually everything's covered in snow by this time of year. She wasn't going to complain, as beautiful as the snow was, it awful to work in. No matter what kind of shoe Rebecca tried, she always ended up with soggy, cold socks by the end of the working day. She hopped into Luke's truck before he even had the chance to put it in park, pressing her fingers against the heaters, and offering Luke a shy smile. "Hello." "Wow," she heard him murmur. "You look really nice." She huffed a little laugh. "Try not to sound too surprised." No. He backtracked frantically and she laughed. The horror on his face was comical. "I'm not surprised, you always look beautiful. I'm just a little embarrassed. You dressed up, but I figured we could just go to the diner again." She instantly felt like massive pressure had just been lifted off her shoulders and let out a small sigh of relief. The diner actually sounds amazing. I don't usually feel comfortable in high-end restaurants. "Okay. Great, because that's where I was taking us." He laughed. "It's been a few days since I've been there actually. One of the staff called me this morning to ask if I was feeling okay." Rebecca giggled into her hand. "Not usually the reaction you want, Luke." She paused, watching the dark shapes of trees pass by. "Wait, what did you mean I dressed up? I'm in jeans and a flannel." "Oh, it's the hair, isn't it? My sister says when I actually put effort in doing my hair I look like a completely different person." "No, I love your hair when you have it up too. I just thought you looked beautiful with your hair down, drowning in my coat." He chuckled a little and they fell into silence as he drove. Rebecca didn't know how to reply to that. Men rarely told her she was beautiful. The silence wasn't awkward, but it wasn't their usual comfortable silence either. The air felt charged between them. When Luke pulled up outside of the diner, he got out of the truck and crossed over to open her door and help her out before she could even get her seatbelt off. He put a hand against the small of her back and guided her inside to the booth that they sat in last time, greeting the staff politely as they went. This time, however, he slipped into the same side with her and wrapped an arm around her middle, one large hand squeezing her hip. Rebecca felt like she couldn't breathe. Suddenly having him so close to her, touching her, was overwhelming. All the easy conversations that they had together while they were building their friendship, working together, all seemed like an impossible memory as she sat there beside him, tense and silent. He was starting to sense her discomfort and loosened her grip on her waist. She could feel the silence turning awkward between them but didn't have any idea what to say. This is why she and relationships never worked out. She always got quiet when she got nervous. "I think Henry is going to do really well with the rest of the wolves," Luke said suddenly. "How will we know they don't end up killing him? I'd hate to be out there and find a body," she said, going into work mode. "I put a chip in the back of his neck. We'll know if he wanders off too far from the pack or stops moving." Luke said, and just like that the easy conversation that Rebecca was used to was flowing back and forth between them. They ordered their food, Rebecca knowing this time not to trust Luke's choices lest she end up with a small mountain of food. They started asking each other questions as they waited for their food to cook. "Do you have plans for Thanksgiving?" Luke asked. Rebecca gasped. "That is next week, isn't it? I was just going to drive up to my sister's like usual." "Do you have plans?" "I'm actually spending the holiday with Maggie. Her husband is in Ireland visiting his mother. She's very ill, and her children all have families of their own now. So she invited me, said she had never spent a Thanksgiving alone. I don't have any family myself, so I agreed." "Lucky," Rebecca said. "Have you tried that coffee cake she brings in? I can't believe you get to try the rest of her food." Luke laughed. "Are you going to spend the whole weekend with your sister?" "Oh God, no. No. I'm driving down Wednesday and coming back that Friday," she said quickly. "I suppose I might get to see you that weekend then?" He smiled. "I've got a dog that's been dying to meet you. I could even attempt to cook dinner." "That sounds wonderful, Luke," she said, and couldn't hold back the squeak of surprise when their waitress brought their food out. Apparently no matter what you ordered, you'd be receiving a small mountain of food with your order. "I thought I only ordered a grilled chicken breast," she murmured. "Not the whole chicken." After they finished eating, Luke led her out of the diner and back to his truck, arms snug around her waist. He helped her back into his truck, tugging his coat into place around her shoulders. "You know, I forgot you had this. I thought I had lost it until I saw you walking around in it. It looks good on you." "It's like at least 3 sizes too big on me," she replied. "Well, it's mine, so it looks good on you," he said, and leaned over her to buckle her in. She could feel his warm breath against her throat and couldn't help the shiver that passed through her. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "I could have gotten it. I know that. I just like taking care of you." The drive back to her house seemed to drag on forever, especially with the charged, tense energy that was filling the cab of Luke's truck, bouncing between the two of them. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't the awkward silence from before. Both of them seemed to be thinking the same thing as Luke pulled into her driveway, neither of them saying a word. Finally, Rebecca broke the silence, reaching out to place her hand on his thigh. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, thumb scratching along the fabric of his jeans. "I could make you some coffee or tea." He caught her hand in his own, squeezing it lightly. "Coffee sounds great," he said, and with a flick of his wrist killed the engine on the truck, rushing around to help her out of the passenger side. The hand against her back as they walked to her front door burned through the flannel and against her skin. She dug around in her purse for her keys, inhaling sharply as she felt his warm breath against her neck, the faint touch of his lips following after. It had never been harder to get her keys out and open her front door than it was now, with Luke pressed up against her back, lips trailing a path up and down the side of her neck. Somehow, she managed to get them both inside and instantly put some distance between herself and Luke. "You said you wanted coffee?" she asked as she slipped Luke's flannel off, hanging it on a peg beside the door. She walked into her kitchen, beckoning him to follow. "I only have dark roast. Is that okay?" "That's fine," he said softly and came up behind her, placing his hands on her waist as she filled the pot with water. Her hands shook a little as she set the pot down, snapping it into the coffee machine, and flicking the on button. The whole time she tried to ignore Luke's hands on her waist, thumbs digging patterns into her skin through the fabric. "Am I really going to do this?" Chapter 5. The water slowly dribbled into the coffee pot as Rebecca leaned back against Luke, growing more comfortable with his ministrations. She hummed as his hands traced her waist back to her spine, kneading the muscles there. She felt his ragged breathing across her throat, his heart thudding wildly in his chest above hers as she ran her fingers through his damp hair. Laying exhausted together atop her bedding, Rebecca started to giggle breathlessly. Luke raised his head from her neck. "What? We've ruined my bed," she said, and he sat up, looking around at the mess they had made. Her bedding was soaking wet and sticky, the water from their shower having been absorbed by all her blankets. Even her pillows were soaked from their wet hair. Looking back, maybe we should have just stayed in the shower. "Next time," he said and slapped her hip. "Up. Up, we need to get these changed before it soaks through to the mattress. Rebecca groaned but dragged her body off the bed. Naked, she and Luke changed her sheets, pulling the extra blankets down from the hall closet. When they were curled back under the covers together, Rebecca smiled. If you liked my hair tonight, you're going to love it after a night of sleeping on it wet. Luke chuckled softly, running his fingers up and down her spine. I'm sure it'll look beautiful, like always. With her head pillowed on his chest and his fingers tracing patterns on her back, she fell asleep, dreaming of a baby with black curls and amber eyes. When Rebecca woke, the first thing she thought was that it was way too early to be awake. The first rays of golden light were just starting to stream through her window, illuminating the bed in a halo of soft light. The second thing she noticed was that Luke was no longer lying next to her. The space where he had been was cold. It felt like the bottom of her stomach had dropped out. He wouldn't just sneak out afterwards. He wouldn't, she told herself desperately, but before she could think too much into it, she heard horrifying noises coming from one of the habitats. She sat up and quickly filtered which enclosures were that close to hers, when she heard a loud, infuriated roar. That has to be the lions. She jumped out of bed and quickly threw on her clothes, throwing her mess of hair up into a ponytail, and stuffing her feet into her boots. She threw herself out the door, quickly deciding to forego the ATV, and ran the short distance to the lion's enclosure. She didn't even think twice about letting herself through the gate. She didn't have to go far to see what was wrong. Two male lions stalked a small circle around each other. One was the lion that she had been stalked by early on in her stay here, and one was new to her. His mane was darker and his eyes shining bright amber in the low morning light. She knew this should be impossible. There was only one male lion in this enclosure, and it wasn't like they got a delivery in the middle of the night. However, it was right in front of her, two male lions looking like they involved in a fight to the death. The one with the darker mane lunged forward, muscles across his shoulder rippling as one massive paw came out and swiped across the lion's chest. The fight that ensued was horrifying. All snarls, claws puncturing fur, and teeth tearing at jugulars. After what felt like hours, but Rebecca was sure was actually only a few seconds, the darker-colored lion overpowered the other. He knocked the lion to the dirt, placing a massive paw on his chest to keep him pinned down as he growled low and close against his face. Rebecca felt like someone had glued her feet to the ground, heart thudding wildly in her chest, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the defeated lion walk towards the back of the enclosure. She was left alone with second lion, terrified, watching as it walked towards her bleeding from multiple wounds along his body. There was a loud pop and a series of quick cracks, and Rebecca watched, horrified, as the lion began to twist and morph into the body of a man. The fur rapidly began to shrink back into the body, the bones shifting and popping into a human form as the long mane began to recede, revealing Luke's face. There was one last loud crack and Luke fell to his knees at her feet. He tilted his face up to look at her. "Rebecca, I can explain." She felt calm wash over her. "You don't have to, I get it. This is why I've been seeing animals all over the sanctuary, animals I know shouldn't be there. You were the bear and the leopard and the wolf, weren't you? And that's how you keep the peace between the animals, it's how you communicate with them." "Yes," he croaked, his voice rough. "Those were all me. I would have told you, but I couldn't know how you'd react. It's not exactly something you can work into an everyday conversation. I'm not sure, but I might faint." She breathed and he was instantly standing, gripping her arms. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca, for putting you through that," he told her, rubbing her arms. "I know this must seem surreal. Why don't we go back to your place and I'll make you some tea and we can sit down and talk." She nodded numbly and let him scoop her up and carry her back to her house even though he was naked. He set her on the sofa and went into the kitchen, coming back with a steaming mug of tea. She took it from him, warming her hands against the cup, and wondering which of them would be the first to speak. "It was Luke. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out like that. I wanted to tell you, but I just had been putting it off. I thought you'd run screaming." "I didn't scream," she mumbled. "I know you didn't. You were so brave," he said and reached out to stroke her cheek. "So what you can do," she started to say. "It's real?" She asked and winced when she realized how stupid her question sounded. Luke didn't laugh at her though. Yes, it's real. I'm real. And there are other people out there who can do the same thing? She asked. No, I'm the last of my kind. The rest of my people have died or have been hunted down. Luke said, I've been looking for someone for so long that could help me carry on my line. Preserve the gift. He hesitated. I knew from the moment I met you and you started drilling me about the sanctuary's practices that you were it. You are it for me, Rebecca. And I want you to be that person. But only if you want that too. Her breath caught in her throat. Yes, I want that. She answered. Wait, you said that some of your people were hunted. Does that mean that there are others that know about you? He nodded slowly. Old families, ones that can remember further back than they have any right to. There's not many of them but just enough to hurt us. End our line. There was a man yesterday. She quickly said. He said he was FBI but he was carrying a shotgun and he wouldn't tell me how he got in. He was looking for you. Did he mention a name? He asked. No, well, he called himself Agent Wilson. Do you know him? She asked. No, but I know the name. The Wilsons are an old family and I know they've produced quite a few hunters. He explained. Will you be all right? What will we do? Nothing. He doesn't have any proof. I haven't broken any laws. He can't do anything. Seeing her confusion, he explained. Men like Wilson, the hunters, they're usually police or FBI. It gives them a good way to cover it all up. All they need to do is plant a gun and say the victim tried to use it. Rebecca panicked. But won't he try to do that to you? I'm safe inside the sanctuary. There's no way he's getting in again after what you put him through. I'll just have to be careful when I go out. You know, for someone who's being hunted down by a hunter who killed your entire family, you're oddly calm. He didn't kill my parents. They both died of natural causes. Besides, hunters have really been losing steam in the last 20 years. My guess is that he'll get bored after a few weeks and disappear. So, I'm guessing I shouldn't serve you any tea with silver spoons then? She asked, trying to lighten the mood. Luke laughed. That's a myth and I'm not a werewolf, you know. Silver doesn't affect me. She swallowed, wondering if she should voice the question on the tip of her tongue. And bullets? Real bullets hurt just as bad? Not that I'd know personally. He poked her side, trying to get a smile out of her. Please don't worry about this. I've actually ran into 3 hunters. One even personally apologized to me for what their family had done over the centuries. I promise I'm not in any danger. Okay, she said softly. I trust you. He cupped her face, drawing her in for a soft kiss. Tomorrow is Sunday. It is. She agreed. You have the day off tomorrow. His lips trailed down his neck. I just might be able to get out early. Her lips twisted up into a smirk. I was going to go in anyway and see if I could get some more work done. Lots to do before the holiday. She tapped his thigh. And speaking of work, we should get ready or we're going to be late. He groaned comically against her neck. Technically, we don't have anyone to report to. Are you really going to make those giraffes wait even longer for their breakfast? She fired back. They got ready together, Luke cleaning up the best he could in yesterday's old clothes, promising to go back to his house at lunch and change. You'll scandalize poor Maggie if you don't. Rebecca ha. Chapter 6. The days until Thanksgiving flew by and before Rebecca was even ready for it, she was once again packing her duffel. She wasn't sure how she became so clingy, usually known for being very independent if not cold, but she and Luke had spent every spare minute of their time together. Now that she knew his secret, he would greet her in the habitats in whatever form he happened to be in. Some days she found herself followed by a black wolf and others she was watched by a spotted leopard while he sunned himself on a tree. She found she didn't mind the company while she worked. She also noted that the animals seemed calmer around her whenever Luke was near. There was another reason she felt better knowing Luke was near. She wasn't sure that Wilson had lost interest like Luke assured her he would. All week long, she had the feeling she was being watched in the sanctuary. She had brought it up to Luke one night while they were laying together, his fingers combing through her hair. But he had been quick to reassure her. Rebecca, trust me, if Wilson was wandering around the sanctuary I would know. Especially when I shift, I'd be able to scent him. Rebecca wanted to trust him, to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. She zipped up her duffel after packing a few changes of clothes, gathering her items from the bathroom. Truth be told, she didn't want to leave Luke. Not even for a few days. It didn't feel right to leave now after she just discovered Luke's secret. Not to mention that she also feared he was in danger. Luke wouldn't hear it though. He told her that she needed to go see her family, that it wasn't healthy for them to be so dependent on each other. She hadn't liked the way he said that it would be good for both of them to take a few days apart. She knew he was right, of course. This relationship has been moving faster than any she had ever had before. That didn't mean she wanted to admit it though. She sighed and lugged her duffel into the kitchen, glancing out the window. She wondered if Luke was going to come so she could say goodbye. She practically flew out the door when she saw his truck pull up her driveway. She stopped herself before she ran over and opened his door. No need to look that desperate, she thought. So she waited patiently, like the adult she was, for him to park his truck and slide out of his seat. When he finally ambled over to her, she wound her arms around his neck, standing on her tiptoes so she could press a kiss to his lips. I was worried you weren't going to come. His arms slid around her waist, holding her close. Hey, do you really think I would let you go without saying goodbye? He pressed a kiss to her head. I'm going to miss you. Even if you are only going to be gone for 2 days, she laughed a little. Don't worry. I already miss you so much it's embarrassing. Are you going to be all right, honestly? You're handling all of this really well. Better than I expected. I'm fine, Luke. I know it seems odd that I'm so fine with all of this, with you. But really, I'm mostly relieved. I thought I was going crazy, Luke. He at least looked a little sheepish. Sorry, she tilted her head up, kissing him softly. I'll see you Friday, see you Friday. He murmured against her lips and helped her load her duffel into her Jeep. He kissed her again through the driver's side window. Drive careful. I will. You be careful too, she said and looked at him meaningfully. Watching his image get smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror hurt more than she cared to admit, but she flicked on the radio and tried to prepare for Thanksgiving with her sister. The drive was just a little over 3 hours and sooner than she would have liked. Rebecca was pulling up in front of her sister's white, 2-story house. The door was painted red and there was an apple tree she didn't remember in the corner of her yard. Why doesn't she put up a white picket fence and be done with it? She thought bitterly. With her duffel slung over her shoulders, she stood in front of the cheery red door, knuckles rapping against the fresh paint. 3 identical screams sounded from behind the door before it was thrown open and 3 pairs of little hands were mauling her clothes, pulling her inside. Aunt Becca, they screeched, each one trying to tug her in a different direction. Aunt Becca, I want to show you my room, Mary yelled. She was Rebecca's eldest niece at 8 years old and, unfortunately, not the loudest. No. I want to show her Harry. Amelia, the middle child, shouted. That's my new kitten, Aunt Becca. She told her. I will go see your room and I will go look at your kitten. She told them patiently. Just let me talk to your mother first. Isabella, the youngest of her nieces at 3, started up her trademark scream. The volume rising the longer she felt she was being ignored. The other 2 girls started arguing which one should get their aunt's attention first, and Rebecca wondered how her sister was going to handle today now that she couldn't dip into the wine. The family dog, a middle-aged and slightly neurotic German shepherd, began to bark as Isabella reached that special pitch that seemed to drive the animals out of their minds. I hope I have boys, she thought. That evening, Rebecca and her sister Nancy were curled up in the lounge together, talking in low voices and daring to hope the girls would stay asleep. Nancy was watching her jealously as she sipped on a glass of wild berry wine. One arm curled around the gentle swell of her pregnant belly. So tell me about this new guy, she said. Rebecca hesitated, knowing that she couldn't tell her about what Luke really was. He's great, she finally answered. He works at the sanctuary. He's amazing with the animals, and he's gorgeous. She giggled. You sound really happy, Nancy said. And for once you're not talking about your work, so I'm happy. I am happy. It's pretty serious between us and I know it's fast, but I think he's the one for me. He wants the same things I do, Nancy, and he's just as passionate about his work with the animals. I'm really happy for you. Bex. Just be careful, okay? She pleaded. After everything you went through after Ryan. I don't want to see you like that again. Luke is nothing like Ryan, I promise. Our relationship isn't even the same, it's a completely different dynamic than it was with Ryan. Okay, I just worry about you. She said. As much as we fight and no matter how old you get, I'll always see you as that little 12-year-old brainiac with her nose stuck in her books. Oh, shut up, Rebecca said and shoved her gently on the shoulder. Rebecca didn't want to admit it, but Luke was right. Spending the holiday with her family had been refreshing. Although her nieces were loud and energetic, she knew she never got enough time to spend with them. However, when she woke up Friday morning, still feeling the effects of consuming half her body weight in turkey and hearing the shrieks of 3 little girls who were now awake, she was ready to leave. The drive back seemed to take twice as long as the journey there, but she breathed a sigh of relief as she finally pulled into the driveway of the little house she began to think of as home. She had been surprised to see a thin blanket of snow covering everything though. Oh well, I knew it would snow eventually. It was nice while it lasted, she thought. After she had unpacked her duffel and turned the heat on high in her freezing house, she debated whether or not she should call Luke. Before she could decide, she heard the familiar rumble of his truck approaching and grinned. That's great timing. She ran outside to greet him, but seeing the look on his face had her smile dying on her lips. What's wrong? She heard herself ask. The tracking chip I put in Henry went dark. I don't know where he is, he said quickly. Well, can't you just, she waved her hands around, gesturing to his body, shift into something and track his scent. I tried that. With the fresh snow all the scents are muddled, I can't find anything to go off of. I just came to tell you that I'm going into the wolf habitat again. I need to find him, I might be in there all night. Then I want to go with you. Rebecca said, but Luke was shaking his head. I'm going to be in here all night, Rebecca. It's going to be dark and cold and it's no place for you. Don't you dare say that to me. Just because I can't do what you can doesn't mean I can't help or that I don't want to help. She said, there's tents in the medical center. We can set up a base center in the clearing where we released Henry and his mother. It would be easier if no. She yelled, you're being stubborn right now and you're not thinking. We can set up a base camp with food and water and medical supplies. What if you find him hurt? You're going to take him back to medical alone and in the dark? She took a deep breath. Look, I know you're worried, but we need to be smart about this. You're going to have a place to come back to eat and drink or warm up if you get too cold. I'll stay in the tent and when you find him I'll be there and waiting for whatever he needs. He was quiet for a long moment. It's going to be cold. Lucky for me, I have a warm coat, she said and grabbed Luke's flannel off the peg. Luke drove her to the medical center and together they loaded a tent, sleeping bags, basic medical supplies, and a portable camp stove into Luke's truck. Rebecca ran into the main office, letting Maggie know what was going on. After explaining the situation twice to the frazzled woman, she went into the staff kitchen, raiding the cupboards that Maggie kept well stocked. She carried the bag of food and water back to Luke's truck. Done, that was the last thing we needed, she told him, barely having time to buckle herself in before Luke was speeding towards the wolf habitat. There's 80 acres. She said. How long will it take you to cover that much ground? Hopefully I won't have to cover half of that before I find him. Luke said and Rebecca jumped out of the truck to open the gate, closing it after Luke pulled the truck through. The drive to the clearing was short and tense, Luke not bothering to say much as they went through the motions of setting up the tent. Rebecca put her hand on his arm as he hammered the last stake into the ground. Listen, I can take it from here. She told him, go find him. Luke grabbed her face, pressing a firm kiss to her forehead. Thank you. He breathed and started tugging off his clothes, leaving them in a pile on the snowy ground which Rebecca quickly scooped up before they could get too wet. Stay warm, he told her, and then his body was changing. Thick black fur began to grow rapidly from his skin, his teeth elongating and sharpening in his mouth while the cracking and popping of his bones as they shifted and changed shape set her teeth on edge. When it was done, a familiar black wolf stood in front of her, his glowing amber eyes staring into hers. She felt a wet tongue lapping at her hand before he was sprinting off into the trees. "Luke!" She shouted after him, making a face as she wiped her hand on her jeans. She heard him bark once in answering before the sound of him faded completely, leaving her alone in the clearing, snow falling quietly around her. She could feel the chill starting to sting her face, so she quickly finished setting up the tent. She made a makeshift bed out of layers and layers of sleeping bags they had taken from the medical center and dragged the camping stove into the tent, turning it on to try and get some heat. She set up a folding card table in one corner, setting out the medical supplies until it resembled a medical station. Lastly, bringing in the bag of food and water, she zipped up the tent, hoping the warmth from the camping stove would stay in her little cocoon. She hoped that the propane from the flames wouldn't gas her out until it warmed up the tent. She had never had to use a camping stove as a makeshift heater before. She crawled under the sleeping bags, turning off the stove when the smell of propane got too strong for her to stand any longer. She lamented that she didn't bring anything with her to do and considered going out and doing her own search for the wolf pup before deciding against it. "The last thing Luke needs is me stumbling around out there getting my scent all over while he's trying to find Henry," she thought. Instead, she decided to grab her satchel and see if she could start working on any of those reports she needed to finish about the tiger enclosure. The hours slowly passed as she worked. She turned the camping stove on and off as needed, trying to keep the temperature in the tent above freezing. When the afternoon melted into evening and it got too dark to write, she pulled the miniature flashlight she kept tucked inside her satchel and decided to go through the food she took from the staff kitchen. She didn't know if Luke was even going to come back tonight, but she knew if he did he'd probably appreciate something warm to eat. She found half a loaf of bread and a package of pre-sliced cheddar cheese and decided that she could make some simple cheesy toast. So she turned on the camping stove on low, setting the bread directly on the burner and put a slice of cheese on top. The end result was a piece of slightly charred bread covered in bubbly cheese that wasn't quite melted in the center. It certainly wasn't the best thing she had ever eaten, but it was warm and filled her grumbling stomach. Halfway through her second piece, the zipper to the tent door was yanked down and Luke was falling inside through the flap. He was naked and dripping with melted snow, panting hard. "Luke!" Rebecca cried and jumped up. She quickly zipped up the door of the tent, trying to save the heat before focusing her attention on Luke. Her heart dropped as she noticed he didn't have the wolf pup in his arms but didn't let herself focus on it. Instead, she pulled him up and off the floor, shrugging off Luke's flannel to pull off her shirt, trying to pat him dry with it. "We should have brought some towels," she thought, shivering as the cold air hit her bare skin. Once he was as dry as she could get him, she yanked on his flannel again, and pulled Luke to her nest of sleeping bags. "Get under those, you need to warm up," she said and busied herself making him a few slices of cheesy toast. Between them, they finished off the remaining bread and cheese, Luke shoving the food into his mouth as if he were ravenous. "He's not in the North Plot," Luke said once he was finished eating. "There's no sign of the pack there either." "Well, that's AW." Settling against his side, she reached out and flicked off the camping stove, not wanting to poison them while they were trying to rest. He laid his head back against the sleeping bag, closing his eyes as he pulled her firmly back against his chest. Wait, she said, sitting up and pushing him off of her. "Don't you hear that?" Listening together they heard the sound of a long yowl in the distance. "That might be Henry. Either way, it's an animal hurt," Luke said and got to his feet, pulling on his clothes. Seeing the question in her eyes he said, "I can hear them. I don't need to shift to find whatever's out there." Once he was dressed and quickly slipped on his boots. "Be ready when I get back," he told her simply and slipped out of the tent, zipping it back up after him. Rebecca shimmied her jeans back up her thighs, crawling out of the sleeping bag to fix the buttons of Luke's flannel, double-checking that her bra wasn't visible through the gaps between buttons. She stood ready by her makeshift medical center, waiting for whatever Luke was going to bring back. Her flashlight was propped up but only provided a soft glow of light, so she flicked on the camping stove, hoping the flame might brighten the tent a little. Minutes passed by slowly, but soon Luke was moving through the flap of the tent, Henry cradled in his hands. Her heart dropped as she spotted smears of blood across Luke's shirt. Chapter 7. She motioned him to bring the pup over so she could look at him. He was by the river. Luke said. Alone, I didn't see any signs of the rest of the pack. Where is he hurt? She asked as he set him on the card table in front of her. Luke grabbed her flashlight and shone it on the back of Henry's neck, revealing the deep, bleeding puncture wounds of a bite mark. Rebecca chewed her bottom lip nervously as she examined it, hoping it wouldn't need stitches. Luke kept the beam of the flashlight on the pup's neck. I guess the pack did reject him, she said, and got to work disinfecting the wound as Luke held the squirming pup still. And that explains why your chip stopped working. The wolf that bit him must have broken it. Luke shook his head. That bite isn't from one of my wolves, he said, and leaned down to scent the wound. It was a dog, a bloodhound. But how could a dog get into the sanctuary? She asked, tearing open a pack of gauze to wrap up Henry's wound. And how could a dog get him away from the pack without the wolves killing him? I don't know, and that's what worries me the most. Luke admitted, there's something not right about this, there's everything wrong with this. Luke held up a hand, stopping her from continuing, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. That's smoke. I smell smoke. Rebecca sniffed a few times and wrinkled her nose at the thick, acrid scent of smoke. I smell it too, it's close. She scooped up Henry. We have to get out of here, we can just leave the tent. She grabbed her satchel before freezing as a thought crossed her mind. Luke, how could a fire start in this weather? Everything is covered in 3 inches of snow. Get Henry and get to the truck, get out of here and call the fire department. He said firmly, pushing his keys into her pocket. Tell me what's going on. She demanded. Anything will burn if you use enough fuel, he said slowly, and her eyes widened as she caught on. It's man-made. Her breath caught in her throat, images of Wilson flashing across her mind. Someone's trying to smoke us out, Luke said. I need you to go, I need to know that you'll be safe. Why can't you come with me? She asked. I have to put the fire out, he said. For all we know, they sprayed fuel across half the sanctuary. The animals can't get out, Rebecca, and the smoke will get them before the flames do. But we don't know who else is out there. Please, just take the truck and get out of here. I can't concentrate if I don't know that you're safe. Okay, she agreed, not wanting to waste any more time. Just promise me you'll get out as soon as you can, I promise, he said, and pressed a firm kiss to her lips before ushering her out of the tent. As soon as she stepped outside, she knew they were in trouble. Standing beside an alcove of trees, Agent Wilson had the barrel of his shotgun trained on them. He had a clinical expression on his face, looking almost bored as he stood there. 2 bloodhounds flanked him, hackles raised and teeth bared as they waited for a signal from their master. Luke was quick to shove her behind him, trying to shield her with his body. She had a hard time keeping the pup still as Henry began to squirm in her arms, probably sensing the rising fear and tension in the clearing. You don't have to do this, Luke said, slowly raising his hands. There's no reason for anyone to get hurt. Smoke drifted over them, thick and stinking, and Rebecca could see the glow of the fire as it burned. It's so close, she thought. I'm not going to hurt anyone, he said. Just putting down a couple of animals. There's no reason for you to do this. Luke said again, the 2 of us, we're a dying breed. Hunters, shifters, none of that means anything anymore. Can't you see that? This isn't the 14th century. You don't need hide behind your fire and fear what's in the dark. I have a job, a home, and a family. I'm a person. What I can do doesn't define who I am. You're an abomination, he said. A demon. It doesn't matter what you say you are. You're a monster. At that moment, Rebecca understood. This man was insane. There would be no reasoning with him. The cold, dead eyes and clinical expression on his face told her everything she needed to know. She pressed up close against Luke's back, trying to enjoy the warmth and the feel of his body against hers. We're going to die here, she thought sadly. At least let her go. She has nothing to do with this, Luke said. She's not like me, I can't do that. I let her go and then 9 months down the road I have another shifter to kill. He said, she's not pregnant. Luke told him, can you know that for sure? That at this second she's not carrying your child? He asked, and Luke remained silent. That's what I thought. You know I can't let you hurt her. Luke said, and Rebecca felt hope swell in her before she realized that it didn't matter. She's seen Luke shift. She knows how long it takes him, and Wilson would be able to shoot both of them before he finished changing forms. I think we both know it doesn't matter, Wilson said, and trained the barrel of his gun on the center of Luke's chest. How did you find me in the first place? Luke asked quickly, and Rebecca knew he was trying to stall. She didn't know why though. The fire was slowly moving towards them, and if Wilson didn't kill them then that probably would. I talked to a hunter friend of mine. Said he tracked you down to apologize. Wilson scoffed. He was pathetic, and now I'm out here having to finish the job. Run to the truck. Luke told her, his voice low. What? She hissed, but the sound of deep, rumbling growls cut off anything Luke was going to say. The missing wolf pack emerged from the trees behind Agent Wilson, surrounding him and his two dogs in a half circle. Luke shoved her towards the truck, diving to the side as Wilson fired his gun. Rebecca ran to the truck, placing Henry inside the cab before crouching behind it. She knew she should leave, but she couldn't stand the thought of leaving Luke here. Luke gave a sharp whistle and the wolves lunged, part of the pack tearing off to chase the bloodhounds while the others stayed with their alpha. Wilson spun around just as the leader of the pack lunged forward and fired the shotgun, sending a spray of bullets into the wolf's chest. Rebecca screamed as the wolf's body fell into the snow, blood leaking out onto the ground, staining the snow red. Steam rose from the body, and Rebecca felt hot tears well in her eyes. The distraction gave Luke just enough time to change forms, and she watched, eyes wide with worry, as a familiar black wolf snarled and threw himself at Wilson. Giant paws pressed against Wilson's shoulders, knocking him down as his teeth tore into his throat. Blood sprayed across the snow, the shotgun flying from Wilson's hands with the momentum of the fall. Luke staggered away from the body, shaking the blood out of his fur before changing back as blood bubbled out from the hole in Wilson's neck. His rasping, stuttering breath stopped as Luke slipped back into his ruined clothes, and he reached her just in time to rub her back as she retched into the snow. He's dead, she thought numbly. Luke killed him. He rubbed circles on her back. Rebecca, we need to stop the fire, before it gets completely out of control. Okay. She repeated the words, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand and pushing herself to her feet. They jogged towards the flames, covering their mouths and noses as the smoke grew thicker around them. Thankfully, because of the cold, wet conditions, the fire wasn't as bad as they had feared, and they killed the flames by dousing them with snow. When the last patch had been dispatched, they made their way back to the clearing. Rebecca blew on her fingers, trying to warm them. They were burning from the cold. She coughed into her elbow as they neared the truck, still feeling the effects of the smoke. Henry was in the window, yipping and yowling to get out. I'm glad to see his injury isn't affecting him, she thought. She let him out of the truck as the wolves returned from chasing down the dogs, one of those being the pup's mother. Rebecca winced as she saw them licking the blood from their muzzles, not wanting to think about what happened to Wilson's dogs. She reunited the pup with his mother and looked around the clearing for Luke, deliberately avoiding looking at the body of Wilson. She found him kneeling beside the body of the dead wolf, fingers stroking down through his fur. She knelt in the snow next to him, ignoring the burn in her knees. She rubbed his arm. I'm so sorry, Luke. They saved our lives. I'll have to come back to bury him. He said, I'll come back with you, she said, and tried to tug him up. But we need to go now. We need to call the police and get them out here. He nodded slowly and pushed to his feet, wrapping an arm around her waist. How are you? Are you all right? I'll be fine, she told him. The drive out of the habit was quiet, and as soon as she got a signal on her phone she called the police. She gave them a slightly altered version of what happened though. After she was done she turned to Luke. You need to run home and change your clothes. The cops are going to wonder what happened to you and we won't have anything to tell them. Luke nodded and touched her cheek before hopping in his truck and speeding towards his house. Luckily enough, he got back just before the police met them outside the sanctuary, newly clothed and blood-free. What the hell happened here, Luke? One of the officers asked, and Rebecca was relieved to see that they knew each other. That would make their story easier to swallow. Rebecca and I were out looking for a missing wolf when we noticed the fire. We went to put it out but found this guy with his hunting dogs. I don't know where he was from, but he claimed he set the fire as a distraction. He had heard how nice our elk are. Damn poachers, the officer muttered. His dogs started going nuts, barking. They must have caught the scent of something. Luke continued. I guess that drew the wolves and, well, you can see what happened. Sounds to me like the bastard got what was coming to him. The officer chortled and Rebecca frowned. She didn't know how he could laugh when someone was lying dead a few feet away from them. He may have been insane, he may have tried to kill them, but they were still talking about someone's life. He didn't have to watch him die, she thought. Either way, now we have a dead body on our hands. Luke said, Look, you both look exhausted and this seems like a pretty clear-cut case to me. Why don't you two get something to eat and get some sleep? The boys are coming from the morgue to get the body and I can have Nora type up some statements based on what you said back at the station. Then we'll call it a day. The officer said, Thanks, but make sure none of your boys touch that wolf. I want to bury him, Luke said, and before Rebecca really knew what was happening, she was back in Luke's truck being driven back to her house. Is it really that easy? She asked. What? Someone types some stuff on the computer and this all just goes away, I guess. Luke said, Paul seems to think so, the officer. He said quickly when he saw Rebecca look, it just seems too easy. That after everything we went through, it all just goes away. He put his hand on her thigh. It doesn't just go away though, we'll never forget this. I killed a man, Rebecca, and I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. I saw. She said quietly. I watched while it happened. He parked his truck in front of her house, unbuckling her belt and tugging her across the seat until he was holding her against his chest. I am so sorry, Rebecca, for everything that I've put you through. I haven't run screaming yet. She said, offering him a small smile. No, I guess you haven't. He said and pressed a soft kiss to her lips. You need to eat and sleep, so do you. Come with me. It didn't take much for him to agree and they went inside together. Rebecca made a quick spaghetti and they ate in silence, savoring the warmth. When they were done eating, exhaustion settled over them, and they crawled into her bed. They were still fully dressed when they fell asleep on top of the covers. Rebecca's alarm woke them at 6, and after only 5 hours of sleep she wanted nothing more than to hit the off button. However, they had a mountain of phone calls and paperwork they'd have to fill out because of the night before. Not to mention they still had the wolf to bury. They also had Henry to find, again, to check over and make sure his wounds would heal okay. She rolled over to see Luke already awake and watching her. She wrinkled her brow. Were you watching me sleep? No, I just woke up. He said and covered his mouth as he yawned wide. How are you doing? I'd be better if you weren't always looking at me like you're expecting me to fall apart. Sorry, he said, not sounding sorry at all. After everything that's happened, can you really blame me? No, I guess not. This has been the craziest month of my life. She froze. Has it really only been a month? I'm afraid so. He answered, never mind. Maybe you should be worried that I'll fall apart. She smacked lightly at his chest when she saw him looking worried. I'm joking, but we do really need to get up. I'm getting a headache just thinking about the work we have waiting for us. She said a reluctant goodbye to Luke after feeding him a quick breakfast of eggs and toast. She knew he had to go home to change, but she still hated to see him go. After he had gone, she took a long, hot shower and changed into her most comfortable clothes. It was way too cold out for her hair to air dry, so she took a chance on her blow-dryer, figuring she'd just end up putting her hair up anyway. When she was finally ready, she drove down to their main office, steeling herself before opening the door. Maggie? She called and squeaked when she was pulled into a bone-crushing hug by the larger woman. I pulled into work and there were police everywhere. Paul told me what happened. Are you all right? Is Luke okay? I heard one of the animals was killed. That's going to be a paperwork nightmare. She said, speaking quickly all while trying to squeeze the life out of Rebecca. Maggie, she said, trying to slip out of her hold. I'm okay. Luke's okay. One of the wolves was killed and the pup is hurt, but the rest of them are okay. I just came in to ask a huge favor, actually. Of course, anything. She said, I was wondering if you could start on the paperwork. Just fill out anything that you can and Luke and I can come in and do the rest later, maybe? I wouldn't ask, but Luke and I already have a long day ahead of us. Don't worry, I was actually already working on the incident report when you came in. She told her, Maggie, you are the best, seriously. I can't thank you enough. I have to go. I told Luke I'd meet him at the place and he's probably already there. I'll see you tonight then, Rebecca. Try not to work too hard, either of you. I can't imagine what you two went through out there. She said. No, you really can't, Rebecca thought as she left the office. When she got to the clearing, Luke was already there like she thought he might be, packing away the tent and all their borrowed supplies in the back of his truck. Wilson's body was gone, but there was still blood all over the ground. It looked even worse in the daylight. She noticed the body of the wolf was still where it fell, covered by a thin layer of snow. At least that cop was true to his word and no one moved it, she thought. You should have waited for me. She called out to him, climbing out of her jeep. I would have helped, digging the hole is going to be hard enough. I thought I'd give you a break, he said and stuffed the last of their supplies into the back, exchanging them for 2 shovels. He offered her one of them. You really haven't changed your mind about burying him? It would be so much easier to cremate, she said, already thinking how hard it was going to be to dig the hole for the grave in this weather. No, I want to bury him, Luke said. I owe him that. She couldn't argue with him, not about this. So she helped him clear the snow off a patch of ground, using her shovel to chip away at the cold, frozen dirt. Their progress was slow and the work was hard, but as hours passed, they got closer towards something that looked somewhat like a grave. They worked through lunch and by afternoon ended up with a hole deep enough to bury the wolf. Luke picked his body up in his arms and set him in the ground. He ran his fingers through the fur one last time before climbing out of the grave. Burying the body was a lot easier than digging the grave had been, but Rebecca was still exhausted when she patted down the last shovel of dirt. Her arms burned and she was covered in a light sheen of sweat despite the cold weather. She didn't regret it though. Burying the animal seemed to have eased some of the tension Luke had on his shoulders. She was a little worried though as they loaded the shovels into the back of Luke's truck. He hadn't said one word to her the whole time they were working. Luke? She questioned when she realized he was walking towards the trees rather than to his truck. I'm going to shift and go find Henry. I'll bring him to the medical center, so why don't you go ahead and meet me there? He asked. And after we get him checked out you better head home and get some rest. You're exhausted. You'll go home with me, won't you? She asked him quietly, not liking the expression on his face when he answered her. I think I should stay at my place tonight. You should have some time to think about if this is really what you want. If I'm really what you want. Rebecca felt rage building within her and before she could stop herself, she snapped. I'm sick of you always telling me what it is you think I need or should have. She stormed towards him, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him firmly on the mouth. I want you, you idiot. I need you. And I'll take you, crazy supernatural powers and all. He looked down at her and at any other moment the shock on his face would have been comical. Okay, he said finally, and for the record, I want you too, temper and all. She kissed him again, feeling exhausted and giddy and not at all embarrassed. Chapter 8. The month of December passed quickly for Rebecca. She and Luke had decided to continue their relationship, but in lieu of everything that had happened, they had decided it would be for the best if they took things a little slower. At least for the meantime. So they went on dates to the diner and Luke took her to meet his dog, who she fell instantly in love with, and they snuck kissing and lingering glances. Rebecca sighed as she checked her calendar again, noting the bright red X that she had circled 2 weeks ago but deciding she didn't want to worry about that yet. She couldn't believe that it was only 2 days until Christmas. Even worse, her sister had somehow convinced her to bring Luke to meet the family. She knew it had been a mistake to agree, but now she could only hope that her sister didn't scare him away. Or that her nieces didn't scare Luke away from the thought of having children. They were planning on driving to her sister's house in the morning, and since Rebecca always liked to leave early, she got Luke to agree to spend the night. She nearly laughed, remembering the way he had stared at her when she asked. He looked almost scandalized, as if she planned to get him over and steal his virtue. However, it may not be completely true that she didn't have any alternative motives. While taking things slow had been a nice change, Rebecca was ready to move their relationship forward again. So she was planning on cooking a simple dinner that night, mainly because simple was all she could cook, and then make her move. If anything, she figured she could always use the shower trick again. That seemed to work well enough last time. She checked the time on her phone, cursing when she realized she only had 5 minutes to get to the medical center before she was late. She grabbed her keys and made her way to her Jeep, not trusting the ATV now that they had nearly a foot of snow. My Jeep is also much warmer, she thought. When she arrived at the medical center, she noticed Luke's truck already parked outside and had a sneaking suspicion that he had been there all morning. She tsked quietly to herself. That man is way too attached, she muttered, climbing out of her Jeep and sprinting to the door of the center. She shut the door behind her, shaking the snow from her hair. Luke? She called out. Sure enough, he walked out of the back, Henry laying calmly in his arms. You have ruined that animal, she told him. Some wolf he is. Look at him, you've made him into a lapdog. I have not. Luke protested. He's a ruthless killer. A ruthless killer that was supposed to go back into his habitat 2 weeks ago. You can't put it off any longer. His wounds have completely healed. I know, he said softly. Are you ready to go? She nodded and watched him to make sure he was actually going to follow her out. I have to be careful or he might just end up sneaking him home, she thought. I'll drive us, she said. It took a long time for her to be able to feel comfortable going into the wolf habitat alone. Just until recently she would insist that Luke go in with her. She pulled into the habitat once Luke opened the gate, waiting for him to hop back in before driving them towards the river. They hadn't returned to the clearing since burying the wolf there. Her thoughts drifted to Agent Wilson as they drove. It had turned out that he really was FBI. It didn't hurt their story though because he apparently had a reputation for acting withdrawn and strange around his colleagues. She was grateful that he didn't have a wife or any kids. When the local police contacted his closing living kin, it was his brother who turned up at their sanctuary. Luke seemed sure that he was also a hunter, but he seemed to have no love for his dead sibling. He went along with their fabricated story well enough and didn't act shocked when the police had told him what his brother had done. He didn't stay in town long, just a few days to arrange for a quick cremation before he was flying out again. Rebecca had been worried for weeks that he'd return with a small army of hunters with him, but Luke assured her that Wilson had been an oddity. Finally, she accepted what he was telling her about hunters becoming just as rare as shifters were. Pulling up a few feet before the slant of the riverbank, Rebecca hesitated to turn of the engine. Can't we just stay here and be warm until the pack arrive? She asked. Luke shook his head. Sorry, love, they won't come out until we get out of the car. Rebecca sighed but shut off the engine, hopping out of the Jeep and groaning when she sunk into the snow a little past her ankles. She always forgot that the snow was a little deeper out here. They didn't have to wait long for the first of the wolves to trot out from the trees. Henry's mother walked right up towards Rebecca and Luke, stopping a few feet away from them. She growled low in her throat, as if sensing Luke's hesitation to give up her baby. He at least had the decency to look embarrassed. Sorry, he muttered and set Henry down in the snow in front of him. The pup turned and looked at Luke for a long moment before bouncing off towards his mother. She gave him a sharp nip to the ear and nudged him back into the trees. They watched the wolves disappear into the tree line, and soon Rebecca was bouncing from foot to try and stay warm. Okay, they're gone. Can we go back to the car now? She asked. Luke laughed. Yes, let's go before you freeze solid. Rebecca practically threw herself into her Jeep, turning on the engine and pressing her fingers to the heater vents as she waited for it to warm up. Luke smiled as he watched her. What do you have left today? She smirked. I am actually done for the day. Instead of spending my morning playing with puppies, I was actually working. You know, I could probably take the rest of the day off. He said. Well, you could, but don't think you're seeing me until tonight. I have to get ready and then I have to cook dinner. I still need to pack too, and I can't have you distracting me. She said. Okay, he relented. But what's the earliest I can come over? She giggled. You are impossible. I guess you can come over at 5, but only if you promise not to bother me before then. That means no dropping by, no calling, and no texting. You make it sound like all I ever do is bother you. He protested. She patted his thigh. It's okay. I like it when you bother me. But not today, got it? He mock saluted her. Understood. She dropped him back off at the medical center and drove home, trying to contain her excitement. Luke had no idea what she had planned for tonight. As soon as she got home, she dug through the dresser, pulling out the thin package she had received in the mail not 3 days ago. She still hadn't tried it on yet, nervous because she rarely purchased clothes online. Opening it, she pulled out the lump of thin, black material and held it over her body in the mirror. The black cocktail dress stopped at her mid-thigh, the halter-style neckline scooping to show just enough cleavage. She was excited and nervous for Luke to see her in something like this. She rarely dressed up and she knew that Luke knew that as well. She just hoped that he understood what a big deal this was for her to be doing this for him. Laying the dress out on her bed, she stripped for a shower, blushing when she remembered what she and Luke had done in there. She took a long shower, using her favorite shampoo and body wash combo, guaranteeing that she would smell like vanilla. When she was done, she dried off, wrapping the towel around her waist, and decided to tackle her hair next. She had decided to wear it like she did for their first date, using plenty of mousse to craft sleek, manicured curls. Afterwards, she sat at her vanity and dug out her single tube of nail polish, deciding that if she was going to go all out, then she was going to go all out. The color was a beautiful rich, glossy red that she always thought accentuated her dark hair and pale complexion. She rarely wore it though because her job required her to be very hands-on and usually ruined her nails anyway. Once her nails were dry, she applied a light coat of makeup, just enough to enhance her natural features. Checking the time and realizing it was almost already 4, she hurried to the kitchen to start dinner. She cooked wrapped in her towel, knowing that if she put on her dress she'd spill sauce all over it. So ever mindful of her freshly painted nails, Rebecca cooked a simple roasted chicken breast, steamed some green beans with a bit of garlic and salt, and put some store-bought rolls into the oven to warm. By the time the food was ready and plated, she had just enough time to slip into her dress before Luke was supposed to arrive. She glanced at the mirror to check her final appearance and was impressed by how well the dress fit her. It skimmed her waist, hugged her curves, and made her neck look long and lovely. There was a short knock on the door and she hurried to slip into a pair of black flats before hurrying off to answer it. She could see Luke's breath catch as she opened the door, his eyes widening comically. "Rebecca," he said her name like a prayer and slowly stepped inside. His eyes dragged from her feet to her head, taking in every inch of her. "I knew you were going to do something like this. I knew the moment you asked." He breathed. "Well," she smirked and spun around, the curls of her hair flipping tantalizingly as she walked into the kitchen. "You could always leave, it's not too late." She heard him following her and her smirk grew. "It was too late the moment you opened the door," he said. "The food is on the table," she said flippantly, loving the way his eyes couldn't stop roaming her body. "I'm really underdressed," he said, looking down at his jeans and flannel shirt. He groaned when he caught sight of the food. "And I thought you said you couldn't cook." "This looks amazing, Rebecca, thank you," she said and motioned for him to sit. "And you're not underdressed. I just wanted to do something special and dress up for you." They dug into their food, eating in companionable silence. When they were done she placed their plates in the sink and asked him if he wanted to join her in her bedroom. "There isn't a scenario that exists where I would say no," he said, and she took his hand, intertwining their fingers as she pulled him to her room. When Rebecca finally caught her breath, she asked, "So are vampires real too?" A laugh burst its way out of Luke's throat. "What?" "Well, ever since I found out about what you could do I wanted to know," she explained. He chuckled softly. "No, they don't exist." "Oh," she said. "What about werewolves?" "No, those were myths inspired by shifters. It's easier to change into a wolf because they have those all around the world. Not in every country, of course, but in a lot more than lions. So is there anything out there that's real?" "Fairies? Witches? Leprechauns?" she asked. "I can't really say. My father died when I was young and my mother not long after. I didn't have anyone to talk to about these things, so I really couldn't tell you," he said, fingers combing through her hair. "Then how do you know about vampires and werewolves?" she asked. "When I was 8 they were playing Stephen King movies on Halloween," he began to explain. "I saw Salem's Lot and The Silver Bullet and was terrified out of my mind. I had nightmares for a week until my dad sat me down and explained those things didn't actually exist." He kissed her softly, cutting off her next question. "Shouldn't we get to sleep? We have a 3-hour drive tomorrow, don't remind me," she said, then groaned. "I forgot to pack, don't worry, I'll help you," he murmured, already drifting off to sleep. In the morning, she was pleasantly surprised to a breakfast of toast and coffee and in bed. She kissed Luke's cheek in thanks after she was done eating and directed him what to pack in her duffel as she got dressed. She glanced around her little house as she did her morning routine. "You know, I think I'm actually going to miss this place when I'm gone," she said, and Luke's hands faltered as he put her sweater into her travel bag. "You don't have to go," he said finally. "The sanctuary could really use another full-time zoologist." "Oh, I already know that. I already talked to Maggie about applying for a long-term position. I just assumed I'd end up at your house," she said, offering his a cheeky smile, and his answering grin was blinding. "I'd love for you to move in. I just didn't think you'd want to so soon. I wanted to give you your space," he said, and as soon as he did she was laughing at him. "You practically live in my pocket," she said. "But I love it," she finished quickly, seeing his worried expression. "I love you," she finished. He walked towards her, pecking her lips. "I love you too." Later that day, walking up to her sister's house hand in hand, Rebecca wondered what the future was going to be like for her and Luke. Thinking back to the unused tampons at the bottom of her dresser and the bright red X that was circled on her calendar 2 weeks ago, she thought may have some idea. Rebecca smiled as she looked out the kitchen window, reflecting back on the last 10 years of her life as the soft light of the summer sun glinted across the water of the creek. The bubbling water curved a path through their yard and continued twisting down the mountain valley. Luke's home really was beautiful. The picturesque 2-story log home, nestled within the sloping hills of the mountain, was like something out of a fairy tale. Once they had moved into together, she knew this was the place where she wanted to raise their children. It was an added bonus that it was so close to the sanctuary. She was pulled from her thoughts as a little hand clutched her shirt, tugging for her attention. She looked down at the sweet face of her daughter and felt warmth spread in her chest. The little girl had inherited her dark curls, but even at the age of 5, Rebecca could tell her eyes would stay the bright amber of her father's. "Mommy, Jack won't let me watch my show." At the mention of her son, Rebecca sighed. The 9-year-old had recently discovered the wonders of video games from a friend at school, and Rebecca was finding it nearly impossible to keep him off of the TV. At any given time she could walk in the living room and catch him, blue eyes locked on the screen of whatever game he was currently playing. "Kara, why don't you tell your brother to come see me in the kitchen?" "I have a better idea," Luke said, leaning on the doorframe that led to the back porch. "That doe and her 2 fawns are back. Why don't you go get your brother and the 2 of you can help me feed them some apple slices? Can I pet the babies?" she asked and squealed when Luke nodded. Thank you. She ran off towards the living room, and Rebecca knew that if there was anything that could get Jack off of the TV, it was the prospect of baby animals. He had definitely inherited his parents' love of animals. That's not the only thing he inherited, she thought, recalling the day she watched, heart in her throat, as Luke guided him through his first transformation. She smiled as Luke walked over to her, large hands holding her waist as he pressed a sweet kiss to her lips. "I love you," he murmured. "So much. I love you too," she told him, patting his arm as their children stampeded into the kitchen. "You're needed now, love," she said, and he led them out to the back porch. She watched out the window as Jack fed slices of apple to the doe, who had her head pressed between the bars of their porch railing. Luke lifted Kara by the waist so she could reach the identical spotted fawns below and tilted his head so he could smile at her in the window. Her heart soared as she took in the picture that was her family. Before meeting Luke, she had never imagined this being a possibility, but here it was, all hers. The end.